Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
Charles expected the evening to be boring. That alone should have warned him. Some of life's biggest surprises arrive on the days that seem completely ordinary. The corporate acquisition event was being held inside one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels. The ballroom was filled with executives in tailored suits, investors carrying glasses of expensive wine, reporters moving between tables, and business leaders discussing numbers large enough to make most people dizzy. Charles had attended dozens of events like this during his career. Most followed the same pattern: networking, presentations, applause, more networking. Nothing memorable. As he stepped through the ballroom entrance, he loosened his tie and glanced around the crowded room. "Let's survive this and get home," he muttered to himself. One of his co-workers laughed. "That's the most exciting thing you've said all week." Charles smiled politely. Truthfully, he wasn't interested in corporate celebrations anymore. Not after everything that had happened over the past few years. His priorities had changed. His definition of success had changed. The things that once impressed him didn't carry the same weight anymore. Money was useful. Status was useful. But neither could keep you warm when your life fell apart. Neither could sit beside you when your heart was broken. Neither could build a family. Charles moved toward an empty table near the middle of the ballroom. The event host stood on stage, reviewing details about a major acquisition that had dominated business headlines for months. Most attendees listened carefully. Charles listened just enough to remain polite. His attention drifted toward his phone. A text message sat at the top of his screen. Anne, his fiancée. A small smile appeared on his face. Even now, after a long day, seeing her name instantly improved his mood. The message was simple. "Good luck tonight. Don't let corporate people bore you to death." Charles chuckled. Only Anne would send something like that. He quickly typed back, "Trying my best. If I fall asleep, tell everyone I fought bravely." A few seconds later, 3 laughing emojis appeared. That was Anne. She could make ordinary moments feel lighter. The host's voice echoed through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight." Polite applause followed. Charles slipped his phone into his pocket. The presentation continued. Charts, financial projections, growth forecasts. The usual. A few people checked their watches. Others quietly spoke among themselves. Nothing seemed unusual until the atmosphere changed. At first it was subtle. A few executives near the front suddenly straightened in their seats. Conversations stopped. Several investors turned toward the ballroom entrance. Reporters grabbed their cameras. The host paused in the middle of a sentence. Charles frowned. What just happened? Nobody answered, because everyone was looking in the same direction. The entrance doors opened. A woman stepped inside. Charles barely noticed her at first. His attention was still on the crowd's reaction. Then he followed everyone's gaze and froze. His heart slammed against his chest. For a second, he genuinely thought he was seeing the wrong person. It couldn't be. There was no way. Yet it was. Anne, standing near the ballroom entrance. Charles blinked. Once, twice. Still, Anne, his fiancée. The woman he planned to marry. The woman who spent most mornings drinking coffee with him before work. The woman who laughed at his terrible jokes. The woman everyone believed worked as part of a cleaning crew. Anne looked different tonight. Not because of expensive clothing. Not because of jewelry. Not because of makeup. She looked different because of the way the room reacted to her. People weren't simply noticing her. They were waiting for her. Several executives immediately approached. Investors rushed forward. Industry leaders smiled. The same people who rarely acknowledged anyone outside their social circles suddenly seemed eager to earn her attention. Charles sat motionless. What is happening? One executive near him whispered to another. She's finally here. Another replied. The board wouldn't start without her. Charles's stomach tightened. Without her? The board. What board? His eyes never left Anne. She greeted people calmly. No excitement. No arrogance. No dramatic entrance. She simply walked through the room, as though she had done this thousands of times before, because apparently she had. The event host stepped away from the podium. His posture immediately changed. Respect, deference, expectation. The ballroom became unusually quiet. Then something happened that made even less sense. Everyone stood. Executives, investors, business leaders. Every person in the room rose to their feet. Applause exploded across the ballroom. The sound echoed against the walls. Charles remained seated, not intentionally. His body simply forgot how to move. His mind was trying desperately to catch up. The applause continued. Anne smiled politely. Then she walked toward the stage. Not toward a seat. Not toward a guest section. Toward the stage. Toward the podium. Toward the center of the entire event. Charles slowly stood with everyone else. His pulse raced. Questions crashed through his mind. Why was she on stage? Why was everyone applauding? Why did these people seem to know her? Why did nobody appear surprised? Anne stepped onto the platform. The host extended his hand. She shook it. The crowd applauded even harder. Then the host spoke into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the visionary behind today's acquisition. The room erupted. More applause, more excitement, more admiration. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. No, that couldn't be right. Visionary? Acquisition? There had to be some misunderstanding. The host continued. Owner, founder, lead investor, chairwoman. Each title hit Charles like a physical blow. Owner, founder, lead investor, chairwoman. His breathing slowed, not because he was calming down, because he was struggling to process what he was hearing. Anne stood confidently behind the podium. The woman he thought he knew. The woman everyone else thought they knew. The woman who spent evenings talking about family, dreams, and ordinary life. The woman who pushed cleaning carts through office hallways. The woman people ignored every day. Apparently owned companies worth billions. The room admired her, respected her, feared disappointing her, wanted access to her, wanted approval from her. And Charles had no idea, not a clue, not a single clue. The realization hit harder than anything else. He wasn't discovering that Anne was wealthy. He was discovering that the entire world seemed to know something about her that he didn't. Anne adjusted the microphone. The room immediately fell silent. Every eye focused on her, including Charles's, especially Charles's. Because at that moment, one question echoed louder than the applause. Who was Anne? And why had she hidden this from him? Who was Anne? The question refused to leave Charles's mind, even as she stood confidently on stage, even as powerful executives hung on every word she spoke, even as reporters scribbled notes and investors nodded in approval. Charles barely heard the presentation. His attention remained fixed on the woman he planned to marry, the woman who had somehow become a complete stranger in the span of 5 minutes. Or maybe that wasn't true. Maybe she wasn't a stranger at all. Maybe she was still exactly the same Anne. The Anne who laughed until tears formed in her eyes whenever he attempted one of his terrible jokes. The Anne who insisted that every food truck in New York deserved a fair chance before being judged. The Anne who spent hours listening whenever he had a difficult day. The Anne who somehow made ordinary moments feel important. Yet none of that explained what he was seeing. The room viewed Anne differently. The room saw power, influence, wealth, authority. Charles saw something else. He saw the woman who once argued with him for 20 minutes over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. For a moment, his confusion mixed with something deeper, something uncomfortable, a memory, a painful one. Because standing inside that ballroom, surrounded by billion-dollar conversations, Charles found himself thinking about another woman, a woman he hadn't wanted to think about in a very long time. Years earlier, Charles had been sitting inside a restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became one of the worst nights of his life. At the time, he believed his future was already planned. He was engaged. The wedding discussions had started. Guest lists, venues, honeymoon destinations, the small details that couples spend months organizing. Charles remembered arriving early that evening. He remembered ordering her favorite drink. He remembered feeling optimistic. The memory still felt sharp, because he remembered exactly how quickly everything changed. She arrived 20 minutes late. That wasn't unusual. What felt unusual was her expression. She wouldn't look him in the eye. She kept checking her phone. Her smile seemed forced. Charles noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah." The answer came too quickly. A few moments passed. Then another. The silence between them felt strange. Finally, she placed her phone on the table and exhaled slowly. "Charles." The way she said his name made his stomach tighten. Nobody starts a happy conversation that way. "What is it?" She looked down, then back up, then down again, as though rehearsing words she didn't want to say. "I'm sorry." Charles stared at her. "For what?" Another pause, longer this time. Then the sentence arrived. The sentence that changed everything. "I don't think we should get married." The sounds inside the restaurant seemed to disappear. People were talking. Glasses were clinking. Music was playing. Yet Charles heard none of it. His mind locked onto those 7 words. "I don't think we should get married." He laughed, softly, not because anything was funny, because his brain refused to accept what it had heard. "What are you talking about?" She looked away. That hurt almost as much as the words, because people look away when they don't want to witness the damage they're causing. "Charles." "No." He shook his head. "No, don't do that." "Do what?" "Talk to me like we're strangers." For a second, genuine guilt crossed her face. Then it vanished. "I met someone." There it was. The truth. Simple. Direct. Brutal. Charles felt his chest tighten. "Someone else?" She nodded. The answer landed heavily between them. A few seconds passed. Then Charles asked the question every person asks in that situation. "Do you love him?" The silence that followed was almost worse than the answer. Because she didn't immediately say yes, she thought about it. Eventually, she spoke. "I think I can have a better future with him." Charles blinked. A better future. Not deeper love. Not stronger connection. Not greater compatibility. A better future. The phrase lingered in the air. "What does that mean?" She folded her hands together. "He can provide things I want." Charles stared at her. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about betrayal, fueled by passion. This wasn't a dramatic romance. It was a financial decision. The other man was wealthy. Very wealthy. The kind of wealthy that attracted attention whenever he entered a room. The kind of wealthy featured in magazines. The kind of wealthy people discussed during conversations about success. Years of commitment had apparently lost a competition against a bank account. Charles sat quietly, not because he had nothing to say, because he suddenly had too much to say. Anger, disappointment, confusion, humiliation, pain. Every emotion collided at once, yet none of them escaped. Instead, he simply asked, "So that's it?" She nodded. Charles looked out the restaurant window. The city lights reflected against the water. Cars moved across distant streets. People continued living their lives. The world hadn't stopped. His world had. That was the strange thing about heartbreak. The person experiencing it feels everything collapsing. Everyone else keeps moving. He remembered sitting there after she left. Alone. The untouched drinks still on the table. The empty chair across from him. The future he thought he had disappearing in less than 20 minutes. No shouting. No dramatic scene. No public confrontation. Just silence. Painfully quiet silence. For months afterward, Charles questioned himself. Was he not successful enough? Not ambitious enough? Not wealthy enough? Had years of loyalty meant nothing? The experience changed him. Not immediately. The wounds took time. Some nights were harder than others. Some mornings felt heavier than they should have. Friends encouraged him to move on. Coworkers offered advice. Most of it wasn't helpful, because heartbreak isn't solved by advice. It heals through time, through growth, through perspective. Slowly, Charles began rebuilding his life, not because he wanted revenge, not because he wanted to prove anyone wrong, because he refused to let one painful chapter define the rest of his story. Looking back now, standing inside that ballroom, Charles finally understood something. If his former fiancée had never left, he never would have met Anne. The realization struck him unexpectedly. Years earlier, a woman had walked away because she believed money mattered more than character. Now fate had placed him in front of a woman whose wealth exceeded anything he could have imagined. Yet Anne had never once acted superior, never once tried to impress him, never once used her success as leverage. The contrast couldn't have been greater. One woman chose money, the other hid it. One woman measured value through wealth, the other measured value through character. And somehow, against all odds, Charles had fallen in love with the second one. Back inside the ballroom, applause filled the room once more. Anne had finished a portion of her presentation. Investors looked impressed. Executives looked eager. Reporters looked fascinated. Charles looked stunned, because another question had just entered his mind. A question that would determine everything. Would learning the truth about Anne change the way he saw her? Or would he become exactly like every person she had spent years trying to avoid? The answer to that question would shape both of their futures. Neither of them knew it yet. At this point, you might be wondering what you would do if you were sitting where Charles was sitting. Be honest. Most people like to believe they would react perfectly. Most people like to believe money wouldn't affect their decisions. Most people like to believe they would see the person before the wealth. But life has a way of testing beliefs when we least expect it. Because Charles wasn't just discovering that Anne was wealthy. He was discovering that the woman he planned to marry had hidden an enormous part of her life from him. And that raises a difficult question. A question many people avoid asking themselves. Have you ever lost someone because they thought you weren't rich enough? Maybe it wasn't a fiancé. Maybe it wasn't a romantic relationship. Maybe it was a friend, a business partner, a family member, someone who suddenly treated you differently because of what you had or what you didn't have. The truth is, almost everyone has experienced some version of that pain. The pain of realizing that your value was being measured by something other than your character. Charles knew that feeling all too well. Years earlier, the woman he intended to spend his life with looked him in the eye and decided someone else's money was worth more than years of love and commitment. That kind of rejection leaves scars, not always visible ones, but scars all the same. It makes people question themselves. It makes people question others. It makes people wonder whether genuine love even exists anymore. For a long time, Charles carried those questions with him, quietly, the way many people do. Because society often tells men to move on quickly, to stay strong, to act unaffected, to bury disappointment, and keep going. Yet some wounds don't disappear simply because you ignore them. They stay, waiting, teaching lessons you never asked to learn. Perhaps that's why Charles became more observant, more careful, more interested in character than appearances. The heartbreak that nearly broke him ended up changing the way he viewed people, not immediately. Growth rarely happens overnight, but little by little he started paying attention to how people treated others. Not powerful people, not wealthy people, everyone. The receptionist, the security guard, the waiter bringing food to the table, the delivery driver carrying heavy packages, the cleaner working late after everyone else had gone home. Because character often reveals itself in moments nobody thinks are important. And that's exactly what Anne had been studying for years. Which leads to another question. Have you ever wondered whether someone loved you for who you are, or simply for what you could provide? It's an uncomfortable question, because most people don't know the answer until life forces them to find out. Some discover it during financial hardship. Others discover it after success arrives. Some discover it during illness. Others discover it during failure. The circumstances vary. The lesson remains the same. The people who truly care about you often reveal themselves when there is nothing to gain. Anne understood that lesson better than almost anyone. She had spent years watching people's behavior change the moment wealth entered a conversation. The same person who ignored someone on Monday would suddenly become friendly on Tuesday after discovering they were wealthy. The same person who dismissed someone as unimportant would suddenly seek their approval. Money didn't create character. It revealed it. That was one reason Anne chose anonymity. She wanted honesty. She wanted authenticity. She wanted to know who people really were when they believed she had nothing to offer them. Most people failed that test. Some passed. Charles was one of the few who did. Not because he knew he was being observed. Not because he expected a reward. Not because he hoped to gain anything. He was kind when nobody important was watching. Or at least when he believed nobody important was watching. That's what made this story different. Because what Charles experienced would have made many people bitter. Many people would have become angry, distrustful, cynical, closed off. After all, how many times can someone be disappointed before they stop believing in love? How many times can someone be judged unfairly before they stop trusting people? How many times can a heart break before it refuses to open again? Those are difficult questions, and there are no easy answers. What matters is what a person chooses afterward. Charles had every reason to become guarded. Every reason to push people away. Every reason to assume the worst. Yet somehow he didn't. That doesn't mean healing was easy. It wasn't. That doesn't mean he never struggled. He did. That doesn't mean he immediately trusted Anne. Trust takes time, especially after betrayal. But he kept moving forward. One step at a time. One day at a time. One conversation at a time. And that's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Because the moment Charles met Anne, neither of them knew they were carrying lessons the other desperately needed. Charles needed someone who valued character more than wealth. Anne needed someone who valued her more than her fortune. Neither knew it at the time. Neither was searching for it. Yet life has a strange way of bringing people together when they least expect it. The corporate ballroom, the standing ovation, the billion-dollar secret. Those moments may seem like the center of this story. They aren't. They're only the result. The real story began much earlier. Long before the applause. Long before the shocking revelation. Long before anyone discovered who Anne truly was. It began with heartbreak, healing, unexpected friendship, and two people who saw something in each other that the rest of the world completely missed. The question is not whether Anne is a billionaire. The question is whether two people can build something real in a world where money often changes everything. And what you're about to hear proves that sometimes the greatest blessing in your life arrives disguised as the exact opposite of what you were looking for. Charles thought he had already lost the love story he wanted. He had no idea his real story was only beginning. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. And if you've been enjoying our stories, take a quick second to like this video and leave a comment below. It may seem like a small thing, but every comment helps YouTube recommend these stories to more people who need encouragement, hope, and a reminder that good character still matters. Today's story carries a lesson that many people learn the hard way. A lesson about love, a lesson about loyalty, a lesson about appearances, and a lesson about the danger of judging someone's worth based on money. As you listen, I want you to think about something. If you met someone with no title, no fancy reputation, and no obvious signs of success, how would you treat them? Would you still show respect? Would you still show kindness? Would you still value them? Or would you overlook them the way so many people do every day? Because sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner has a story nobody knows. Sometimes the person others dismiss carries more wisdom than the loudest voice in the room. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the very person capable of changing your life forever. That's exactly what happened to Charles. There was a time when Charles believed his future was already planned. He believed he knew who he would marry. He believed he knew what success looked like. He believed hard work and loyalty would naturally lead him toward the life he wanted. For a while, everything seemed to support that belief. His career was stable. His future looked promising. His relationship appeared solid. From the outside, many people would have looked at his life and assumed he had everything under control. What they couldn't see was how fragile that future actually was. Because sometimes the biggest turning points in life don't announce themselves beforehand. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary moments. A conversation, a decision, a goodbye. One unexpected event can send a person's life in an entirely different direction. Charles was about to learn that lesson firsthand. The difficult part wasn't losing money. The difficult part wasn't professional setbacks. The difficult part wasn't failure. The difficult part was discovering that the person he trusted most viewed him differently than he viewed her. That realization would leave wounds that followed him for a long time. Yet those same wounds would eventually guide him towards something he never expected. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming disappointment means the story is over. Many times, disappointment is simply redirecting the story. At the moment it happens, it feels unfair, painful, confusing. You question everything. You wonder why certain doors closed. You wonder why certain people left. You wonder why life seems determined to move in the opposite direction of your plans. Only later do you realize some departures are actually creating space for better arrivals. Charles didn't understand that yet. At 38 years old, he thought he was moving toward the life he had always wanted. Marriage, family, stability, a future built with someone he loved. Everything appeared to be moving according to plan. Until one evening changed everything. And the worst part? The warning signs had been there. Small changes, subtle differences, moments that seemed insignificant at the time. The kind of moments people often ignore because they want to believe everything is fine. Charles ignored them too, not because he was foolish, because he was hopeful. Hope has a way of making people give situations more chances than they probably deserve. He kept believing things would improve. He kept believing conversations would return to normal. He kept believing the future they had discussed together was still waiting ahead. He had no idea that someone else had already entered the picture. Someone with deeper pockets. Someone whose wealth attracted attention. Someone who would become the reason his entire world came crashing down. The pain of that betrayal would follow Charles for months. It would challenge his confidence, challenge his trust, challenge everything he thought he knew about relationships. Yet if that heartbreak had never happened, he never would have met Anne, the woman whose secret would eventually leave an entire ballroom speechless, the woman whose kindness would slowly rebuild what another person had broken, the woman who would force him to answer one of the most important questions of his life. What truly matters more, money or character? The answer seems obvious when people hear the question. Living it is another matter entirely. And that's why this story matters. Not because of wealth, not because of business success, not because of luxury, because beneath all of those things lies something much more valuable. The story of two people searching for something genuine in a world that often rewards appearances. So settle in. Because before Anne became the billionaire who stunned an entire room, before Charles stood frozen in disbelief at that corporate event, before their lives became connected, there was heartbreak, a painful lesson, and a woman who walked away from the man who loved her because she believed someone richer could offer her more. Let's begin. New York City had taught Charles many lessons. Some came through success. Most came through disappointment. At 38 years old, Charles lived a life that looked impressive from the outside. The kind of life people pointed to when discussing achievement. The kind of life family members proudly mentioned during holiday conversations. The kind of life that appeared complete. Every weekday morning, Charles joined the steady flow of professionals moving through Manhattan. Coffee in hand, phone in pocket, mind already focused on the responsibilities waiting ahead. His position at a respected financial consulting firm had taken years to build. The work demanded long hours, attention to detail, patience, consistency. The rewards were substantial. A comfortable apartment overlooking part of the city skyline, a reliable income, professional respect, opportunities many people spent decades pursuing. By most standards, Charles was successful. Yet success can be a strange thing. People often assume success automatically creates happiness. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it simply creates a more comfortable version of loneliness. Charles rarely admitted that to anyone. Not because he was embarrassed. Because he didn't want to sound ungrateful. He knew how fortunate he was compared to many people. Still, each evening when he returned home, the silence inside his apartment felt larger than the space itself. The city outside buzzed with energy. Inside, everything felt still. That was one reason his relationship meant so much to him. He wasn't chasing luxury. He wasn't chasing status. He wasn't chasing attention. What Charles wanted was much simpler. He wanted someone to build a life with, someone to share ordinary moments with, someone who would still be there when excitement faded and real life began. For a long time he believed he had found exactly that. And because of that belief he invested his whole heart into the future he thought they were creating together. He just didn't realize that future was already beginning to slip away. 3 years before the corporate ballroom revelation, Charles believed his life was finally coming together. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but steadily, the way real success usually happens. Every morning he left his apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side shortly after 7. The routine rarely changed. Coffee, brief review of emails, a walk toward the subway, the familiar movement of thousands of people starting another workday. New York never waited for anyone. That was one of the first lessons the city taught you. No matter how important your problems felt, millions of people were carrying their own. Charles actually liked that about the city. It forced people to keep moving. His career had taken years to build. Nothing had been handed to him. No wealthy family connections. No shortcuts. No miracle opportunities. Everything came through consistency. Long hours. Sacrifices. Patience. By 38, he had established himself as a respected financial consultant. Clients trusted him. Co-workers respected him. Management viewed him as dependable. He wasn't the richest person in Manhattan. Far from it. But he was comfortable. And for most of his adult life, comfortable had been enough. His apartment overlooked part of the city skyline. At night, the light stretched across the distance like a sea of tiny stars. Visitors often complimented the view. Charles appreciated it. Yet if he was honest, the apartment felt too large for one person. Success looked different when nobody was waiting for you at home. That was why his relationship mattered so much. For years, Charles had imagined a future built around family. Not luxury. Family. He wanted children. He wanted weekend activities, school events, holiday traditions, simple moments that became memories. The older he became, the more he realized those things mattered far more than expensive possessions. Money solved problems. Love gave life meaning. At least that was what he believed. And at the time, he thought he had found both stability and love. His fiancée occupied a central place in every plan he made. Whenever he pictured the future, she was there. Whenever he imagined a home, she was there. Whenever he thought about marriage, children, and growing older, she was there. The engagement had filled him with optimism. Friends congratulated him. Coworkers teased him about finally settling down. Even strangers occasionally noticed the happiness in his demeanor. One Friday afternoon, a coworker leaned against his office doorway. "Still smiling every time you look at that engagement ring?" Charles laughed. "Maybe. You're impossible." "I'll take that as a compliment." The coworker pointed toward him. "You should. Most people around here complain about relationships. You somehow seem excited about yours." Charles smiled. Because he genuinely was, at least he thought he was. The relationship appeared strong, stable, healthy. There were disagreements occasionally. Every couple had those. Nothing serious. Nothing alarming. Nothing that suggested trouble ahead. Or so Charles believed. The first warning signs were small. So small they barely registered. A delayed phone call. A canceled dinner. A distracted conversation. Individually, none of those things seemed important. Life became busy. Schedules became complicated. Adults had responsibilities. Charles understood that. One evening he called during his commute home. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah. You sound tired. Long day. Want to get dinner tomorrow?" A short pause followed. Maybe. The answer surprised him. Normally the response would have been immediate. Not enthusiastic necessarily, but immediate. He dismissed the thought. People had difficult days. The next week brought similar moments. Nothing dramatic. Just different. Subtle shifts. Tiny changes. The kind that are easy to explain away when you love someone. One evening, they met for dinner at a restaurant they both enjoyed. The place held good memories. Birthdays. Celebrations. Milestones. Yet the atmosphere felt unusual. Charles noticed it almost immediately. She checked her phone repeatedly. Her attention wandered. Several times he stopped talking because he realized she wasn't listening. "Did you hear what I said?" "What?" He smiled politely. "Exactly." She apologized. The conversation improved briefly. Then the distance returned. Driving home later that night, Charles replayed the evening in his mind. Something felt off. He just couldn't identify what. Over the following months, the pattern continued. Phone calls became shorter. Plans changed more frequently. Excuses became increasingly common. Whenever Charles raised concerns, the answers sounded reasonable. Work stress, family obligations, fatigue, scheduling conflicts. All believable, all understandable. Yet something still felt wrong. One Saturday morning, they sat together in a coffee shop near Central Park. Outside, people walked dogs and pushed strollers. Inside, soft music played through the speakers. Normally, they would have spent hours talking. This time, conversation struggled to gain momentum. Charles stirred his coffee. "You seem distracted lately." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "You've just been distant." "Distant?" "Yeah." A brief silence followed. Then she shrugged. "I think you're overthinking things." Maybe he was. Charles wanted to believe that. He truly did. Because acknowledging the alternative felt uncomfortable. The alternative suggested a problem he wasn't ready to face. Weeks continued passing. The engagement remained intact. Wedding discussions continued. Future plans continued. Yet emotionally, something was changing. Not suddenly, gradually. Like watching a shoreline disappear as a boat drifts farther from land. One evening, Charles returned home, carrying brochures from potential wedding venues. He spread them across the kitchen table. Excitement filled him. This was progress. This was movement toward the future he wanted. He called her immediately. "I found some great options." "That's nice." The response felt strangely flat. Charles glanced down at the brochures. "You don't sound excited." "I'm just tired." "You've been tired a lot lately." Another pause. Longer this time. Then she changed the subject. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Charles remained seated at the kitchen table. The brochures suddenly looked less exciting. For the first time, genuine concern settled into his chest. Not panic. Concern. Because relationships don't usually break all at once. They often weaken quietly before either person fully realizes what's happening. Still, Charles wasn't ready to believe anything serious was wrong. He loved her. He trusted her. He believed every relationship faced difficult periods. That belief kept him moving forward. It kept him making plans. It kept him imagining a future that was already beginning to slip away. What Charles didn't know was that while he was planning a wedding, Someone else had already begun capturing her attention, and very soon the life Charles thought he wanted would collide with a reality he never saw coming. The week after Charles spread wedding venue brochures across his kitchen table, he tried convincing himself things would improve. People went through difficult periods. Relationships faced challenges. Stress affected communication. That was what he told himself. That was what he wanted to believe. Unfortunately, reality was moving in a very different direction. The warning signs that had once been subtle were becoming harder to ignore. Phone calls became less frequent. Text messages became shorter. Plans were canceled more often. Even when they spent time together, it felt as though an invisible wall existed between them. One evening, Charles sat alone in his apartment staring at his phone. The city lights glowed through the large windows behind him. Traffic moved below. The world continued as usual. Yet something inside him felt unsettled. He glanced at the engagement ring on his finger. Normally, it brought comfort. Tonight, it brought questions. A text message appeared. "Can we meet tomorrow evening?" Charles read it twice, then a third time. His stomach tightened. The wording felt formal, cold. Unlike her, he quickly typed back, "Sure. Everything okay?" Several minutes passed before the response arrived. "We'll talk tomorrow." That was all. No heart emoji. No smile. No reassurance. Just 4 words. "We'll talk tomorrow." Charles placed the phone face down on the table. For the first time, genuine fear entered his mind. Not fear of losing the relationship. Fear that the decision had already been made. The following day dragged endlessly. Every meeting felt longer. Every hour moved slower. Co-workers noticed his distraction. One of them stopped by his office. "You okay?" Charles forced a smile. "Yeah?" The co-worker looked unconvinced. That answer usually means no. Charles laughed softly. "Maybe I just need some sleep." The co-worker accepted the answer and moved on. Charles returned to staring at his computer screen. Yet he couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the upcoming conversation. By late afternoon, anxiety had settled heavily inside him. He hated uncertainty. Most people did. At least with bad news. You knew where you stood. Uncertainty kept you trapped between hope and fear. And hope could be dangerous when reality was preparing to disappoint you. That evening, Charles arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes early. The location overlooked the Hudson River. It was one of their favorite places. They had celebrated anniversaries there, birthdays, promotions, special occasions. That history made the choice feel meaningful, which only increased his unease. The hostess escorted him to a table near the window. Charles sat down, ordered water, checked his phone, waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Finally, she arrived. The moment Charles saw her, his heart sank. Not because she looked angry, not because she looked upset, because she looked detached, almost as though she had already emotionally left the relationship. She sat across from him, offered a brief smile, then looked down at the menu. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable. Charles studied her face, searching for answers, searching for reassurance, finding neither. Eventually he broke the silence. "What's going on?" She placed the menu down. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. For a brief moment she seemed nervous. Then she exhaled. "Charles." The way she said his name made his chest tighten. Nobody starts a happy conversation that way. "What is it?" She looked away, toward the river, toward anything except him. Then she spoke. "I'm sorry." Charles stared at her. His pulse quickened. "For what?" A long pause followed. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then the words arrived. "I don't think we should get married." Everything around Charles seemed to stop. The sounds inside the restaurant faded. Conversations disappeared. Music vanished. The world narrowed to a single sentence. "I don't think we should get married." For several seconds, he simply stared at her, trying to understand, trying to process, trying to convince himself he had heard incorrectly. "What?" Her eyes filled with guilt, but not enough guilt to change what came next. I don't think we should move forward. Charles laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because his mind rejected the reality unfolding in front of him. You're serious? She nodded. The movement was small, yet it felt devastating. Charles leaned back in his chair. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Where is this coming from? Another silence, then another. Finally she spoke. I met someone. There it was, the truth. Simple, direct, merciless. Charles felt the air leave his lungs. Someone else. The phrase echoed through his mind. Someone else. Years together. An engagement. Wedding plans. Future dreams. All suddenly competing with two words. Someone else. He swallowed hard. When? She hesitated. A few months ago? The answer hit him harder than expected. A few months. That explained the distance. The cold conversations. The canceled plans. The emotional withdrawal. Everything suddenly made sense. And somehow, that made it worse. Because it meant the relationship hadn't collapsed tonight. It had been collapsing for months, while Charles continued planning a future that no longer existed. He stared down at the table, then looked back at her. Do you love him? The question lingered between them. She didn't answer immediately. That delay told Charles everything. People usually know when they're in love. Eventually, she spoke. I think I can have a better future with him. The answer landed like a punch, not because of what she said, because of what she didn't say. She didn't mention love. She didn't mention connection. She didn't mention happiness. She mentioned a better future. Charles frowned. What does that mean? She folded her hands together. He can provide things I want. Charles stared at her. Slowly. Painfully. The meaning became clear. This wasn't a decision based on love. It was a decision based on wealth. The realization settled heavily inside him. The other man was rich. Very rich. The kind of rich that attracted attention wherever he went. The kind of rich featured in magazines and business articles. The kind of rich that made people listen whenever he entered a room. Charles felt numb. So that's it? She looked down, then nodded. The simplicity of it hurt more than anger would have. Years of commitment. Years of memories. Years of loyalty. Reduced to a financial comparison. Charles looked out the window. The Hudson River reflected the lights from across the city. Everything appeared peaceful. Inside he felt anything but peaceful. I thought we were building a life together. His voice remained calm. Surprisingly calm. She looked uncomfortable. I know. You said yes when I proposed. I know. We planned a wedding. Her eyes filled with tears. I know. Charles shook his head. For the first time, frustration appeared. Then why keep letting me plan for a future you already knew wasn't happening? The question lingered. She had no good answer, because there wasn't one. A painful silence followed. Neither touched their food. Neither reached for their drinks. Neither knew what else to say. The relationship had already ended. The conversation was merely confirming it. Eventually she stood. Tears filled her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. Charles looked at her. Exhaustion replaced anger. Maybe she believed those words. Maybe she didn't. Either way, the damage remained. Without another sentence, she turned and walked away. Charles watched her disappear through the restaurant. Then she was gone. Just like that. The woman he planned to marry. Gone. The future he imagined. Gone. The life he thought he was building. Gone. The chair across from him sat empty. The untouched drinks remained on the table. The engagement ring suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Charles remained seated long after she left. Minutes passed. Then more. The waiter approached, cautiously. Are you all right, sir? Charles looked up, forced a smile. Yeah, it was a lie. A terrible one. But he didn't know what else to say. Eventually, he paid the bill and walked outside. The cold New York air hit his face. People moved along the sidewalks. Couples laughed. Friends talked. Taxis rushed past. The city carried on as though nothing had happened. For Charles, everything had changed. He walked for nearly an hour without a destination, just moving, trying to clear his mind, trying to understand how years of love could end in less than 20 minutes, trying to understand how someone could choose money over everything they had built together. By the time he finally returned home, exhaustion had replaced shock. He entered the apartment, closed the door, and stood silently in the darkness. The future he had spent years imagining was gone, completely gone. And for the first time in a very long while, Charles had absolutely no idea what came next. For the first few weeks after the breakup, Charles moved through life on autopilot. He woke up, went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, returned home, slept, then repeated the process again. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Inside, everything had changed. The apartment that once represented success now felt strangely empty. The future he had carefully planned had vanished. Every room seemed to contain a reminder. The framed photograph on a bookshelf, a restaurant receipt tucked inside a drawer, vacation plans saved on his laptop. Small things, ordinary things, the kinds of things people never notice until memories become painful. One Saturday morning, Charles stood in his kitchen, staring at 2 coffee mugs. For months, he had automatically prepared 2 cups whenever she visited. Now he reached for the second mug without thinking. Halfway through the motion, he stopped. The realization hit him unexpectedly. There would be no visit, no conversation, no wedding, no future together. He slowly placed the mug back into the cabinet, then stood there in silence. Moments like that happened often. Not dramatic moments, not life-changing moments. Just quiet reminders that the life he expected was gone. Those were often the hardest. Friends tried to help. Coworkers tried to help. Everyone had advice. Some encouraged him to start dating immediately. Others suggested focusing entirely on work. A few recommended expensive vacations. Charles appreciated the concern. Yet none of those suggestions addressed what he was actually feeling. He wasn't simply grieving a relationship. He was grieving a future. The future he thought he understood. The future he believed was guaranteed. One evening after work, a coworker invited him to a gathering. "You need to get out of the apartment." Charles smiled. "I get out every day." "You know what I mean." The coworker wasn't wrong. For weeks, Charles had withdrawn from almost everyone. Not intentionally. He simply lacked the energy to pretend everything was fine. Still, he agreed. The gathering took place at a sports bar a few blocks from the office. Several coworkers were already there when Charles arrived. Conversations flowed easily. People laughed. The atmosphere was relaxed. For a while, Charles enjoyed simply being around other people. Then someone brought up relationships. Immediately the mood shifted. One coworker leaned forward. "You know what your problem was?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "My problem?" "Yeah." The coworker took a drink. "You invested too much." Several others nodded. Another chimed in. "Women always want something better." A third added, "That's just how the world works." Charles listened quietly. The discussion continued. More complaints, more bitterness, more blame. By the end of the conversation, everyone seemed eager to explain why trust was pointless, why relationships failed, why people disappointed each other. Charles sat silently for several seconds. Then he shook his head. "I don't think that's true." The table grew quiet. One coworker frowned. "What part?" "All of it." The coworker laughed. "After what happened to you, you're still defending relationships?" Charles leaned back, thinking carefully. "I don't know." "Don't know what?" "I just don't think one person's decision means everybody is the same." The table remained silent. Several coworkers exchanged looks. Charles continued. "If I start assuming everyone is selfish because one person hurt me, then she wins twice." Nobody immediately responded. Eventually, the conversation moved on. Yet the moment stayed with Charles. especially during the subway ride home, because he realized something important. He didn't want to become bitter. The temptation existed. It would have been easy. Easy to blame everyone. Easy to stop trusting. Easy to build walls. Yet bitterness felt like giving away even more of his future. The relationship had already taken enough. He refused to let it take the rest of his life. That decision became a turning point. Not a dramatic turning point. A quiet one. The kind that happens internally before anyone else notices. Instead of focusing on what he lost, Charles gradually began focusing on who he wanted to become. He started exercising more consistently, reading again, exploring parts of New York he had always ignored. Some weekends, he wandered through neighborhoods with no destination, just walking, observing, thinking, learning to enjoy his own company again. The process wasn't linear. Some days felt productive, others felt difficult. Healing rarely follows a straight line. Certain memories still hurt. Certain songs still reminded him of the past. Certain locations still triggered old emotions. But the pain slowly lost its grip. Month by month, step by step, Charles began noticing things he previously overlooked. One afternoon, while waiting in line at a small deli near his office, he watched a customer speak harshly to an elderly cashier. The cashier remained polite, patient, professional. The customer continued complaining, demanding, criticizing. Charles felt uncomfortable watching it. When the customer finally left, Charles stepped forward. "Rough day?" The cashier smiled tiredly. "You could say that." Charles paid for his lunch, then paused. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." The cashier looked genuinely surprised. The reaction stayed with Charles long after he returned to work, because it cost nothing to show kindness, nothing at all. Yet so many people acted as though basic respect was optional. That observation became another lesson. People revealed their character through small moments, not grand speeches, not public appearances. Small moments. How they treated strangers, how they treated service workers, how they treated people who couldn't offer them anything in return. The more Charles paid attention, the more he noticed those differences everywhere. Inside restaurants, on sidewalks, in elevators, at work, especially at work. The office building housed hundreds of employees from multiple companies. Every day, people passed one another without making eye contact. Security guards greeted people who barely acknowledged them. Maintenance staff worked quietly behind the scenes. Cleaning crews arrived after long shifts and left before most employees paid attention. Many workers behaved as though those people were invisible. Charles couldn't understand it. One evening, he held a door open for a maintenance worker carrying equipment. The man smiled. "Appreciate it." "No problem." Charles continued walking. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet it felt more genuine than many business conversations he had experienced recently. That was another thing Heartbreak taught him. Titles impressed him less. Character impressed him more. Months passed. The emotional wounds continued healing. Not completely, but enough. For the first time since the breakup, Charles found himself looking forward instead of backward. His focus returned to work. His energy returned. His sense of humor gradually returned. Co-workers noticed. One of them stopped by his office one afternoon. "You seem different." Charles glanced up from his computer. "Different how?" "Happier." Charles considered the comment. "Maybe. Not happier exactly. Stronger. More grounded. More aware of what truly mattered." The coworker smiled. "Good. We were starting to worry about you." Charles laughed. "It wasn't that bad." "You were pretty bad." The conversation ended with both of them smiling. As the coworker walked away, Charles returned his attention to a report on his desk. A few minutes later, he stood to refill his coffee. The office floor was unusually quiet. Many employees had already left for the evening. As he approached the break area, he noticed someone at the far end of the hallway, a woman pushing a cleaning cart. Nothing unusual about that. The building employed several cleaning crews. Charles barely gave it a second thought. He poured his coffee, checked his phone, then started walking back toward his office. As he passed, the woman maneuvered the cart around a corner. One of the wheels suddenly caught against the edge of the floor. Several supplies shifted. A container nearly fell. Instinctively, Charles stepped forward. "Careful." The woman grabbed the container just before it hit the ground. For a second, both of them reached for it at the same time. The near accident was avoided. The woman laughed softly. "That would have been embarrassing." Charles smiled. "Could have been worse." "How?" "At least, nobody important saw it." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Nobody important?" Charles shrugged. "Good point. That sounded terrible." The woman laughed again. A genuine laugh. Warm, easy, unexpected. For some reason, Charles found himself smiling too. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Then both continued on with their evening. Simple, ordinary, forgettable. Or at least it seemed that way. Neither of them realized it yet. Neither had any reason to. But the brief encounter would soon become one of the most important moments of their lives. Because after months of rebuilding himself, after months of healing, after months of learning how to start over, Charles was about to cross paths with a woman named Anne, and neither of them had the slightest idea how much that meeting would change everything. Long before Charles understood who Anne truly was, there was one thing that defined her more than money ever could: family. Not the kind of family that only gathered during holidays. Not the kind of family that spoke once every few months. The kind that showed up. The kind that checked on each other. The kind that celebrated victories together and carried burdens together. For Anne, family wasn't just part of life. Family was life. Most weekends followed a familiar pattern. Saturday mornings often began with phone calls from relatives checking in. By afternoon, somebody was usually planning a gathering, a cookout, a birthday celebration, a family dinner, an excuse to bring everyone together. The reason rarely mattered. Being together mattered. Anne loved those moments. The laughter, the conversations, the teasing that never seemed to end. The children racing through yards, while adults debated everything from sports to politics. The smell of food filling the air. The music, the stories, the sense of belonging. Some of her favorite memories came from those gatherings. One summer afternoon, she arrived at a family cookout, carrying trays of food. The moment she stepped into the backyard, voices immediately called out, "Look who finally showed up." Anne laughed. "I am not late." "You are." "I'm 15 minutes early." "That's late for this family." The backyard erupted with laughter. That was how things worked. Nobody stayed serious for long. One relative handed her a plate. Another immediately started asking questions. A third wanted updates about her week. The conversations overlapped. Nobody waited for turns. Nobody needed permission to join in. The energy felt alive, warm, comfortable, home. Anne valued that atmosphere because it reminded her what truly mattered. Relationships, community, people, not status, not appearances, not wealth. People. Her upbringing shaped nearly every major decision she made as an adult, including one decision that most people found impossible to understand: the decision to hide her wealth. The irony was almost unbelievable. While millions of people dreamed of becoming wealthy, Anne spent years making sure nobody discovered how wealthy she actually was. Not because she was ashamed, not because she wanted attention. For the exact opposite reason: she wanted honesty. And honesty became surprisingly difficult once money entered the picture. Years earlier, Anne inherited a substantial business portfolio. Over time, she expanded it, improved it, invested wisely, built relationships, made difficult decisions, took calculated risks. The businesses grew, then grew again, and again. By her early 30s, her financial position had reached a level few people could comprehend. The numbers stopped feeling real. The companies operated across multiple industries. Thousands of employees worked within organizations connected to her investments. Financial magazines wanted interviews. Industry conferences wanted appearances. Investors wanted meetings. Everyone wanted something. At first the attention seemed flattering. Then it became exhausting. Because the more successful she became, the harder it became to know who genuinely cared about her. Conversations changed. People changed. Even relationships changed. Someone who barely noticed her before suddenly became interested. Someone who ignored her opinions suddenly wanted her approval. Someone who never returned calls suddenly became available. The pattern repeated itself so often that Anne eventually stopped being surprised. What surprised her was how quickly behavior changed once money became part of the equation. That realization bothered her deeply because she wanted authenticity. She wanted real connections, real friendships, real conversations, not relationships built around what she could provide. One evening after a corporate event, Anne sat alone in her apartment overlooking the city. The event had been successful. Investors were pleased. Business results were strong. Everything looked impressive on paper. Yet, she felt strangely disconnected. She set her phone aside, walked toward the window, and stared out at Manhattan. Below, millions of people lived ordinary lives. Some struggled. Some succeeded. Most simply tried their best. For a moment, Anne found herself envying something many of them probably took for granted. Being seen as a person first. Not a bank account. Not an opportunity. Not a business connection. Just a person. That desire eventually led to one of the most unusual habits of her life. She began spending time in ordinary environments, under complete anonymity. No special treatment. No security teams. No corporate introductions. No titles. Just Anne. The experience changed everything. People behaved differently when they believed you had no influence. Their masks slipped. Their priorities became visible. Their character became easier to recognize. Some people treated everyone with respect. Others only respected power. The difference fascinated her, which was why she continued doing it. For years, many people would have considered the idea ridiculous. A billionaire spending time doing ordinary work, observing everyday interactions, learning from regular people. Anne didn't care, because she learned more during those experiences than she ever learned inside executive boardrooms. Boardrooms revealed business strategy. Ordinary life revealed character, and character mattered far more. Sunday mornings reflected another important part of her life: faith. Church remained one of the few places where she felt grounded, regardless of what was happening professionally. The atmosphere felt familiar, comforting, real. Nobody cared about financial statements. Nobody cared about corporate acquisitions. People cared about people. After services ended, conversations often continued outside. Families gathered. Friends talked. Children played. The sense of community extended far beyond the building itself. Anne appreciated that. Success had brought opportunities. Faith helped keep those opportunities in perspective. Because money could create comfort. It could not create purpose. Purpose came from something deeper. That belief guided her life. It guided her relationships. And it guided her choices, including a choice that would soon place her directly in Charles's path. At the office building where Charles worked, most employees believed the cleaning staff blended into the background. People passed them every day without paying attention. What nobody realized was that one member of that cleaning crew happened to own more wealth than many executives inside the building combined. And among all the people Anne quietly observed during those months, one person had already begun standing out. A financial consultant named Charles. Though at this point he had no idea she was paying attention. Anne had spent years studying people, not in the way scientists studied data, not in the way corporations studied consumers. She studied behavior. The small choices people made when they believed nobody important was paying attention. Those moments revealed more than interviews ever could. More than resumes. More than polished speeches. People often worked very hard to impress individuals they considered important. The real test came when they interacted with people they believed could do nothing for them. That was where character lived. And that was exactly why Anne continued working anonymously. Several days each week, she arrived at the office building wearing the same uniform as everyone else on the contracted cleaning team. No expensive designer clothing. No executive assistants. No reserved parking spaces. No special treatment. Just another employee moving quietly through the building. Most people never looked twice, which was precisely the point. The building itself housed several companies spread across multiple floors. Every day, hundreds of employees entered through the lobby. Some smiled at security personnel. Others walked past without acknowledgement. Some held doors open. Others allowed them to close directly behind them. Tiny moments. Ordinary moments. Yet those moments often revealed extraordinary things about a person's priorities. One Monday morning, Anne stood near a service corridor organizing supplies. Employees streamed past on their way to work. A man carrying coffee accidentally bumped into a maintenance cart. Several items shifted. One nearly fell. The maintenance worker immediately reached for it. The employee never stopped walking, never apologized, never looked back. A few minutes later, another employee approached the same area. This one paused. "Need a hand?" The maintenance worker smiled. "Got it. Thank you." The employee nodded and continued toward the elevators. The difference between the two interactions lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet Anne noticed both. She always noticed. That habit had become second nature. By afternoon, she was working near one of the executive floors. Several employees gathered around a conference room discussing quarterly performance numbers. As the meeting ended, people spilled into the hallway. Some barely noticed the cleaning crew working nearby. Others stepped around them without making eye contact. Nothing unusual, nothing surprising. Anne had seen it all before. What interested her wasn't the behavior itself. It was the consistency. People rarely realized how predictable they became. The way they spoke, the way they reacted, the way they treated others. Patterns emerged quickly, and once you recognized those patterns, character became easier to identify. A few days later, Anne noticed Charles again. Not because he was seeking attention. Actually, the opposite. He seemed completely unaware anyone was observing him. That was what made the moment meaningful. Charles exited an elevator carrying several folders. As he crossed the lobby, he passed a security guard stationed near the entrance. "Morning?" The security guard smiled. "Morning, Charles." The exchange lasted only a second. Yet unlike many people, Charles actually stopped walking long enough to acknowledge the greeting. Simple, respectful, human. Anne noticed. The next day she observed another interaction. This time a delivery driver struggled with several heavy boxes near the loading area. Employees passed continuously. Most glanced briefly before continuing on their way. Charles didn't. He stopped, set down his briefcase, and helped move several boxes inside. The driver looked relieved. "Thank you." "No problem." Then Charles picked up his briefcase and returned to work. No audience. No recognition. No expectation of praise. Just a small act of kindness. Anne found herself smiling, because actions like that were difficult to fake. People could perform generosity when attention was involved. Private kindness was different. Private kindness usually reflected genuine character. Over the following weeks, she began noticing him more frequently, not intentionally at first. Their schedules simply crossed often. The building wasn't large enough to avoid familiar faces forever. Sometimes she saw him near the elevators, other times near the lobby, occasionally in common areas between meetings. The more she observed, the more consistent he appeared. One afternoon, Anne worked near a break area when several employees began discussing office gossip. The conversation eventually shifted toward Charles. Anne didn't intend to listen. The discussion happened close enough that avoiding it became impossible. "Did you hear what happened?" One employee lowered his voice. The engagement ended. Another employee looked surprised. "Seriously?" "Yep." A third shook his head. "That's rough." For a brief moment, sympathy appeared. Then came speculation, assumptions, opinions. The conversation gradually became less compassionate. One employee suggested Charles must have done something wrong. Another joked about failed relationships. Someone else laughed. Anne frowned. She had always disliked moments like that. People discussing another person's pain as though it were entertainment. The conversation continued for several minutes. Eventually, footsteps approached. The group immediately fell silent. Charles appeared at the end of the hallway. He clearly understood what had been happening. Anyone would have. The sudden silence made it obvious. For a second, Anne wondered how he would react. Confrontation would have been understandable. Anger would have been understandable. Embarrassment would have been understandable. Instead, Charles simply nodded politely, collected what he needed, and walked away. No argument. No scene. No bitterness. The employees looked uncomfortable, as they should have, and watched him disappear around the corner. Something about the moment stayed with her. Not because he ignored the situation, because he refused to become the situation. That required restraint. More restraint than most people possessed. Later that evening, Anne found herself thinking about him again. Not romantically. Not yet. Just curiously. Because genuine character was surprisingly rare, especially in environments where status carried so much weight. The following week provided another example. A severe rainstorm swept through Manhattan. Employees arrived soaked. Umbrellas crowded the lobby. Water tracked across the floors. The cleaning team worked continuously trying to keep up, and spent much of the morning near the entrance. People hurried past without slowing down, most focused entirely on reaching their offices. Charles entered shortly before 9. His suit jacket showed signs of the weather. He stopped near the entrance, looked around, then noticed one member of the cleaning crew struggling with a wet floor sign. Without hesitation, he stepped over. Here, the worker looked surprised. Charles steadied the sign, waited until it was secure, then continued toward the elevators. Another small moment. Another unnecessary kindness. Another thing most people wouldn't have bothered doing. Anne watched from across the lobby. She couldn't help comparing him to others she had observed over the years. Executives who spoke passionately about leadership, while treating service workers poorly. Investors who discussed values while showing very little of their own. Business leaders who demanded respect, but rarely offered it. Charles wasn't perfect. Nobody was. Yet there seemed to be an authenticity about him that she respected. And respect was not something she gave easily. As weeks continued passing, Anne learned more through observation. He worked hard, stayed late when necessary, spoke respectfully to everyone, and perhaps most importantly, his behavior didn't change depending on who was standing in front of him. That consistency mattered. People often treated powerful individuals one way and everyone else another. Charles didn't. The receptionist received the same courtesy as senior management. The security guard received the same respect as executives. The cleaning staff received the same acknowledgement as clients. That consistency stood out, especially to someone who spent years studying human behavior. One evening, as Anne pushed a cleaning cart through a quieter section of the building, she noticed Charles leaving his office. The floor was nearly empty. Most employees had already gone home. He walked toward the hallway, carrying a coffee cup. As he passed, he noticed another employee struggling with a box of office supplies. Without hesitation, he stopped and helped. Again. No audience. No recognition. Just instinctive kindness. Anne found herself shaking her head slightly, not because she was surprised anymore, because she was beginning to realize something. The behavior wasn't occasional. It was who he was, and that made him different. What neither of them knew was how quickly their lives were moving toward a moment neither would forget. A moment involving a malfunctioning elevator. 20 unexpected minutes. A conversation neither planned, and the beginning of a friendship that would eventually change everything. At this point, however, they were still strangers, or at least that's what both of them believed. By the time Anne and Charles finally spoke for more than a few seconds, neither of them expected the conversation to matter. That was one of the strange things about life. The moments that changed everything rarely announced themselves in advance. Most of the time they looked completely ordinary. A delayed train, a wrong turn, a random conversation, or in this case, a broken elevator. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of evening most people wanted to end as quickly as possible. The workday had been long. Several meetings had run over schedule. Employees were leaving the building in steady waves. Charles was among the last people still working on his floor. A client presentation scheduled for the following morning required several last-minute adjustments. By the time he finally shut down his computer, the office was nearly empty. He rubbed his eyes, gathered his belongings, and headed toward the elevators. Across the building, Anne was finishing her own responsibilities. Most of the cleaning crew had already completed their assignments. A few remained scattered throughout different floors. Anne pushed her cart toward a storage area, finished organizing supplies, and checked the time. Later than she realized, she decided to head downstairs before going home. As fate would have it, both reached the elevator bank at nearly the same moment. Charles arrived first. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. A second later, Anne approached. For a brief moment, both recognized each other, not personally, just familiar faces from the building. Charles immediately held the door. "Coming down?" Anne smiled. "Unless you've discovered a faster way." Charles stepped aside. "Still working on that." She entered. The doors closed, and neither had the slightest idea what was about to happen. At first, everything seemed normal. The elevator began descending. Quiet music played softly through overhead speakers. The ride should have lasted less than a minute. Instead, halfway between floors, the elevator suddenly jerked. The lights flickered. The car shuddered. Then, everything stopped. Completely. The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then, 3. Charles looked upward. Anne looked toward the doors. Neither moved. The elevator remained motionless. Finally, Charles spoke. "Well," Anne raised an eyebrow. "Well, I think we've encountered a slight complication." Anne laughed, despite herself. "A slight complication? Okay, moderate complication." The elevator remained still. Charles pressed several buttons. Nothing happened. Anne crossed her arms. "That's not encouraging." "No. Please tell me you know something about elevators." "I know they're supposed to move." That earned another laugh. The tension eased slightly. Charles pressed the emergency button. After several moments, a voice answered through the speaker. "The building's maintenance department." Charles explained the situation. The response wasn't reassuring. A technician was already handling another issue elsewhere in the building. Someone would arrive as soon as possible. Estimated wait time? Approximately 20 minutes. Charles stared at the speaker. 20 minutes? The voice apologized, then disconnected. The elevator became quiet again. Anne leaned against the wall. "Well," Charles smiled. "Now you're doing it." "Doing what?" "Using the word well when you don't know what else to say." Anne laughed. "Fair point." Several seconds passed. Then more. The awkwardness began settling in. 2 strangers. 1 small elevator. 20 unexpected minutes. Neither seemed eager to stare at the walls. Charles finally extended his hand. "I'm Charles." Anne looked at the hand, then shook it. Anne officially introduced at last. Apparently the elevator decided it was necessary. Charles nodded. "It seems committed to bringing people together." "That's a very optimistic interpretation." "What's yours?" Anne glanced around. "Mechanical failure." Charles laughed. The sound surprised both of them, because it felt natural, comfortable, unexpectedly comfortable. Most forced conversations felt exactly that, forced. This one didn't. Charles leaned against the opposite wall. "So, how long have you worked here?" "A while." "Do you like it?" Anne considered the question. "Some days." "That's the most honest answer I've heard all week." "What about you?" Charles shrugged. "Same answer." They both laughed. The conversation began moving naturally after that. No pressure. No awkward attempts to impress each other. Just 2 people talking because there was little else to do. At one point, Anne nodded toward his briefcase. Long day? Very. Tough clients? You say that like you've met them. I clean office buildings. She smiled. I've heard enough conversations to qualify for honorary business credentials. Charles laughed. I believe that. Trust me. Half the meetings sound important. The other half sound like people arguing over things nobody will remember next month. That's disturbingly accurate. Thank you. The exchange drew another round of laughter. For the first time in months, Charles found himself genuinely relaxing. No expectations, no emotional pressure, no complicated history, just conversation. At one point, Anne studied him briefly. Can I ask something? Sure. You always seem polite. Charles frowned. That sounded suspicious. It was a compliment. I think. Anne smiled. I mean it. Charles considered the question, then shrugged. My parents always taught me that respect shouldn't depend on somebody's job title. The answer came quickly, without performance, without calculation, simply honesty. Anne noticed, because it matched everything she had already observed. Not everyone believes that. I've noticed. For a brief moment their eyes met. The conversation became quieter, more thoughtful, not uncomfortable, just genuine. Anne looked away first. Something about the exchange lingered. Before either could say more, the lights flickered again. The elevator shifted slightly. Both immediately looked upward, then toward the doors. Nothing happened. Charles sighed dramatically. False alarm. Anne laughed. You looked hopeful. I was. Me too. Another pause followed. This one felt easier than earlier silences, the kind that develop when people stop feeling like strangers. Charles shook his head. You know, this elevator has terrible timing. Why? Because now I have a story nobody will believe. Anne smiled. Which part? The part where I spent 20 minutes trapped with the only person in this building who understands how ridiculous corporate meetings are. Anne laughed again. A full laugh this time. The kind that couldn't be faked. For some reason, Charles found himself smiling too. The maintenance team finally arrived a few minutes later. Voices echoed outside. Tools moved. Instructions were exchanged. Then, with a soft jolt, the elevator came back to life. The doors slowly opened. Both blinked against the brighter hallway lights. Freedom, at last. A maintenance worker apologized repeatedly. Charles assured him it wasn't a problem. Anne gathered her things. For a moment neither moved toward the exit. The conversation had ended so naturally that stopping it felt strangely abrupt. Finally, Anne stepped out first. Charles followed. Well, Anne said. There it is again. What? The word, well. She laughed. Maybe it's useful. Apparently. For a second they simply stood there. Neither seemed in a hurry. Then Anne smiled. It was nice meeting you, Charles. You too? She started walking away. After several steps she glanced back. Try not to get trapped in any more elevators. No promises. Anne shook her head, still smiling, then disappeared around the corner. Charles watched her leave, not because he was immediately attracted to her, not because he was imagining some future relationship, because the conversation had been unexpectedly enjoyable. That was all. At least that's what he told himself. Meanwhile, Anne walked toward the exit carrying the same thought. Unexpectedly enjoyable. Nothing more, nothing less. Neither realized they would continue thinking about that conversation long after reaching home. Neither realized they would begin noticing each other more often. Neither realized that a simple mechanical failure had quietly altered the direction of both their lives. At that moment, all they knew was that a difficult day had somehow ended with laughter, and for both of them, that felt surprisingly nice. The next morning, when Charles arrived at work, he found himself looking toward the elevators, without even realizing it. Several floors away, Anne caught herself doing exactly the same thing. Neither would admit it. Neither fully understood it. But something had begun. Not romance. Not yet. Something simpler, something stronger, the beginning of a friendship, and neither had the slightest idea where that friendship would eventually lead. The morning after the elevator incident, Charles arrived at work expecting a completely normal day. For the most part, that's exactly what he got. Emails waited in his inbox. Meetings filled his calendar. Clients needed attention. Reports required reviewing. Business continued as usual. Yet every now and then, his thoughts drifted back to the previous evening. Not because anything dramatic had happened, because it had been surprisingly pleasant. That was all. At least that's what he told himself. 20 minutes, trapped inside a malfunctioning elevator, shouldn't have been memorable. Yet somehow it was. The conversation had felt effortless, comfortable. The kind of interaction people rarely experienced with strangers. Around mid-morning, Charles headed toward the break area for coffee. As he rounded the corner, he spotted a familiar face. Anne. She was standing near a vending machine. For a second, both looked mildly surprised. Then they smiled. "Look at that," Charles said. "No elevator this time." Anne laughed. "Probably for the best." "I agree. What if we get stuck again?" Charles pretended to think seriously. "Then at least we'd know each other's names this time." Anne shook her head. "You've been waiting to use that joke since last night." The exchange lasted less than a minute. Then both returned to their responsibilities. Simple, brief, yet throughout the day, Charles found himself smiling whenever he remembered it. The following afternoon, their paths crossed again, this time near the lobby. Anne was finishing part of her work while Charles waited for a client. "Elevator behaving today?" she asked. "So far, good. I think it's learned its lesson." Anne laughed. "That's not how machinery works." "That's exactly how machinery works." The conversation continued for another minute before Charles's client arrived. As he walked away, he glanced back. Anne had already returned to work. Yet something about the interaction lingered, not because it was extraordinary, because it felt genuine. And genuine interactions were becoming increasingly rare. Over the next few weeks, those small conversations became routine. Nothing planned, nothing forced, just natural encounters. A greeting near the elevators, a brief conversation near the lobby, a joke exchanged while passing through a hallway. Sometimes they spoke for 30 seconds, sometimes several minutes. The duration didn't matter. What mattered was how easy it felt. One Friday afternoon, Charles walked into the break area carrying a stack of documents. Anne was pouring coffee. She glanced at the papers. "That looks terrible." Charles sighed dramatically. "It is terrible." "How terrible?" "I'd rather be trapped in the elevator again." Anne laughed. "That bad?" "Worse." She poured a second cup, held it up. "Coffee?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "Are you bribing me?" "I'm helping you survive." "I'll accept survival assistance." For the next 10 minutes, they sat at a small table near the window. The conversation drifted from work to food, from food to movies, from movies to terrible public transportation experiences. Neither noticed how quickly time passed. Eventually, Charles checked the clock. "Oh no." "What?" "I'm late." Anne laughed. "Run." Charles stood, gathered his papers, then paused. "Thanks for the coffee." "You're welcome." As he hurried away, Anne found herself smiling. The smile remained longer than she expected. Over the following month, those coffee conversations became increasingly common. Not every day, but often enough to become familiar. Whenever schedules aligned, they found themselves talking. The topics rarely mattered. Sometimes they discussed current events, sometimes local restaurants, sometimes strange things they had witnessed in New York. One afternoon, Charles described a man trying to walk 3 dogs while talking on 2 phones simultaneously. Anne nearly spilled her coffee laughing. "That cannot be real." "It happened." "You're making that up." "I wish I was." Nobody can manage 3 dogs and 2 phones. Apparently, this man believed otherwise. The image continued making Anne laugh long after the conversation ended. What surprised both of them wasn't the humor. It was the comfort, the absence of pressure. Neither expected anything from the other. Neither was trying to impress anyone. They simply enjoyed talking. Trust began forming quietly, the way trust usually does. Not through grand promises, through consistency. Charles noticed that Anne listened carefully when people spoke. Really listened. Most people waited for their turn to talk. Anne paid attention. She remembered details, asked thoughtful questions, made people feel heard. Anne noticed different things about Charles. She noticed his patience, his reliability, his habit of treating everyone with equal respect. The behavior she had observed from a distance remained exactly the same up close. That mattered a lot, because many people presented one version of themselves publicly and another privately. Charles didn't seem interested in performing. He was simply himself. One evening they found themselves leaving the building at nearly the same time. The streets buzzed with typical Manhattan energy. Traffic moved steadily. People hurried toward trains and buses. Charles held the door open. Anne stepped outside. For a moment, neither immediately walked away. Instead, they stood near the entrance, continuing a conversation about a movie neither of them liked. "I still don't understand the ending," Anne said. "There wasn't an ending." "There was." "No." Charles shook his head. "They ran out of ideas." Anne laughed. "You are impossible." "So I've been told." Several seconds passed, then more. Eventually, Anne glanced toward the subway entrance. "I should probably head home." "Probably." Neither moved immediately. The realization felt strange, because neither seemed eager to end the conversation. Finally, Anne smiled. "Good night, Charles." "Good night, Anne." As she walked away, Charles watched her disappear into the crowd. Not because he was infatuated, not because he was imagining romance, because somewhere along the way he had started looking forward to these conversations. That realization surprised him. For months after the breakup, he had avoided emotional investment, avoided expectations, avoided possibilities. Yet Anne felt different, safe, comfortable, easy to be around. Across the city, Anne found herself thinking similar thoughts. She appreciated how uncomplicated things felt. No games, no hidden agendas, no attempts to impress her. Just honesty, just friendship. At least, that's how she described it to herself. And perhaps it was friendship, at least for now, because neither fully understood what was happening. They only knew one thing. The conversations were becoming part of their daily lives, and every day they seemed to matter a little more than the day before. By early December, Charles and Anne had settled into an easy rhythm. Neither planned it, neither discussed it. It simply happened. A conversation here, a coffee break there, a joke exchanged during a busy afternoon. The friendship had become part of their routine, and routines have a way of becoming important before people realize it. For Charles, the change was subtle. Months earlier, he had entered the office focused only on work. Now he occasionally found himself wondering if he'd run into Anne that day. The thought never lasted long, but it happened. For Anne, the change felt equally natural. She looked forward to their conversations, looked forward to the laughter, looked forward to the way Charles somehow made ordinary discussions interesting. Neither spent much time analyzing it. That was probably why the friendship felt so genuine. Nothing was being forced. Nothing was being rushed. Life simply kept placing them in each other's path. Then came the snowstorm. The weather forecast had warned New Yorkers for days. Most ignored it. People in the city were used to forecasts. Sometimes the predictions were accurate. Sometimes they weren't. This time they were. By mid-afternoon, heavy snow had begun falling across Manhattan. By 4 o'clock, visibility had dropped dramatically. Traffic slowed. Public transportation experienced delays. Businesses started sending employees home early. Inside the office building, conversations quickly shifted away from work. Everyone wanted to get home before conditions worsened. Charles glanced out his office window. Snow-covered rooftops, streets, vehicles. Everything seemed wrapped in white. His phone buzzed repeatedly with transit alerts. None looked encouraging. A coworker passed by his office. "You leaving soon?" "Trying to. Good luck." "That bad?" The coworker held up a phone. "Every train line looks terrible." Charles sighed. Perfect. By the time he reached the lobby, hundreds of people were attempting to leave simultaneously. The atmosphere felt chaotic. People checked transit apps, made phone calls, complained about delays. Charles scanned the crowd, then noticed Anne near the entrance. She stood watching the snow through the glass doors. When she spotted him, she smiled. "Looks fun." Charles glanced outside. "If your definition of fun includes freezing temperatures." "It doesn't." "Good." Anne laughed. "How are you getting home?" "I'm still trying to figure that out." "Same." Both looked outside again. The snow continued falling steadily. The sidewalks were crowded. Transportation updates remained discouraging. Finally, Charles shrugged. "I think walking part of the way might actually be faster." Anne considered it. "You know what?" "What?" "I was thinking the same thing." 20 minutes later, they found themselves walking through Manhattan together. Snowflakes drifted steadily from the darkening sky. Streetlights reflected against the snow-covered sidewalks. Cars moved cautiously through intersections. People hurried past wrapped in scarves and heavy coats. The city looked completely different, quieter somehow, softer. For a while they discussed ordinary things. Weather, holiday plans, work. The conversation flowed easily, the way it always did. Yet something about the evening felt different. Perhaps it was the atmosphere. Perhaps it was the slower pace. Or perhaps friendship had simply reached a point where deeper conversations felt natural. Whatever the reason, the discussion gradually shifted. At one point, Anne glanced toward him. "Can I ask something?" Charles smiled. "You always ask that before asking something serious." "That's because I'm polite." "No. It's because you're about to make me uncomfortable." Anne laughed. "Maybe a little." "There it is." She shook her head. Then her expression softened. "How are you really doing?" Charles looked at her. The question surprised him, not because of the words, because she genuinely wanted the answer. Most people asked casually. Anne didn't. For several moments he watched snow gather along the edge of the sidewalk. Then he shrugged. "Better." "That's good." It took a while. Anne nodded. Neither needed to clarify what they were discussing. The broken engagement remained an unspoken part of his story. Eventually, Charles continued. "There was a period when I thought I'd never trust anyone again." The admission surprised even him. He rarely discussed those feelings, especially outside close friendships. Anne listened quietly, allowing him space, allowing him time. "I kept asking myself what I missed." Charles laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because the memory felt distant now. "I replayed every conversation." "That's normal." "I know." He kicked lightly at a patch of snow. "The strange part is that eventually I stopped being angry." Anne glanced at him. "What happened?" Charles thought carefully. "I realized carrying anger wasn't helping me." The answer came slowly. "Honestly, it wasn't changing anything." Anne nodded. "Understanding. Real understanding. Not sympathy. Understanding." Charles continued walking. The relationship ended. A few snowflakes landed on his coat. "I couldn't control that." "True. But I could control what happened afterward." Anne smiled slightly. "What did you choose?" Charles looked ahead, toward the lights stretching through the city. "I decided I didn't want one person's decision to define the rest of my life." The answer lingered between them. Anne respected it, more than she expected, because many people became bitter after experiences like that. Many people stopped trusting entirely. Charles hadn't. The realization made her admire him even more. For several minutes, they walked quietly. The silence felt comfortable. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Eventually, Charles glanced toward her. My turn. Anne smiled. My turn for what? Questions. She laughed. I should have seen that coming. You should have? Charles hesitated, then asked gently, have you ever been lonely? The question caught her off guard, not because it was offensive, because it touched something she rarely discussed. Anne looked down briefly, then back up. Yes. The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without pretending otherwise. Charles nodded, waiting, not pushing. Anne appreciated that. Most people rushed to fill silence. Charles allowed it. Finally, she continued, I think people misunderstand loneliness. What do you mean? They assume being around people prevents it. Charles listened. The snow continued falling around them. The city moved quietly in the background. Anne spoke carefully, as if loneliness only happens when you're physically alone. She smiled faintly. I've been surrounded by people and still felt lonely. Charles understood that. He really did, and continued. Sometimes you can spend an entire day talking to people and still feel like nobody actually knows you. The honesty surprised her, yet once the words started, they became difficult to stop. I think everyone wants connection. She looked ahead. Real connection. Not superficial conversations. Not small talk. Not expectations. Connection. Charles found himself studying her expression. For the first time, he realized there was more vulnerability beneath her confidence than he had previously noticed. Anne wasn't simply talking. She was revealing something personal, something real, and that trust mattered a great deal. That sounds exhausting. Anne laughed softly. Sometimes. Several moments passed. Then she added quietly, especially when people make assumptions about who you are. Charles nodded. He didn't fully understand what she meant. Not yet. But he understood the emotion behind it, and that was enough. Their conversation continued as they crossed several more blocks. The topics shifted naturally. Dreams, goals, life, the future. Neither noticed how much time had passed. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. At one point, they stopped near a small park, covered in fresh snow. The city lights reflected beautifully across the landscape. Anne smiled. Okay, that's actually nice. Charles laughed. You finally admitted it. Admitted what? The snow looks good. Don't get carried away. Too late. Anne shook her head, still smiling. The laughter felt lighter now, because something meaningful had happened. Not romance. Not yet. Something equally important. Trust. Real trust. The kind that develops when people reveal pieces of themselves they usually keep hidden. By the time they reached the point where their routes separated, neither immediately mentioned leaving. The realization surprised both of them. For a second, neither spoke. Then Anne glanced toward her direction. I guess this is me. Charles nodded. I guess it is. Neither moved. Not right away. The pause lingered, small, yet noticeable. Finally Anne smiled. I'm glad we walked. Me too. The answer came instantly, without thought, without hesitation. Anne noticed. So did Charles. For a brief moment neither looked away. Then both laughed at the awkwardness. The tension dissolved immediately. But something remained. Something new. Something neither had fully felt before. As Anne walked away, Charles watched her disappear into the snowy evening. And for the first time since meeting her, a thought entered his mind that he couldn't quite ignore. Maybe this friendship was becoming more important than he realized. Several blocks away, Anne found herself smiling for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Because the truth was simple. The walk had started as a solution to a transportation problem. It had ended as something neither of them would ever forget. And without realizing it, both had taken the first step towards something much deeper than friendship. The snowstorm walk stayed with both of them, not because anything dramatic happened. No declarations, no sudden romance, no life-changing confession, just a conversation, a long conversation. Yet some conversations leave an impression that refuses to disappear. The following Monday, Charles arrived at work carrying the same focus he usually brought to the office. At least that was the plan. Unfortunately, his concentration lasted less than an hour. Every time he found himself staring at a spreadsheet for too long, his thoughts drifted back to that snowy evening. The laughter, the honesty, the ease of the conversation. It had felt different from anything he had experienced in a long time. More importantly, it had felt real. Around midday, he walked toward the break area for coffee. As he approached, he noticed Anne standing near the counter. For reasons he couldn't explain, his mood immediately improved. Anne noticed him too. "Good morning. It's noon." "Good correction." She smiled. "I try." Charles poured coffee. For a few moments they discussed ordinary things. The weekend, the weather, work. The conversation flowed naturally. Then a brief silence appeared. Not uncomfortable. Just a pause. The kind that often arrives before somebody says something they have been considering. Charles cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" Anne immediately laughed. "That sounds suspicious." "It isn't." "That's exactly what suspicious people say." Charles shook his head. "I walked into that one." "You really did?" For a second, neither spoke. Then Charles decided to stop overthinking. "Would you want to get dinner sometime?" The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, no games, no elaborate setup, just honesty. Anne looked at him. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Then a smile followed. Not a polite smile, a genuine one. "I'd like that." Charles felt an unexpected sense of relief. "Good. When? Friday?" "Friday works." The answer came easily. Neither tried to make the moment more complicated than it needed to be. Yet after Anne returned to work, both found themselves smiling more than usual. The rest of the week moved slowly. At least it felt slow. By Friday evening, Manhattan buzzed with its usual energy. People filled sidewalks, traffic, crowded intersections. Restaurants prepared for busy dinner hours. Charles arrived at the agreed meeting place 10 minutes early, then immediately laughed at himself. Because being early was exactly what nervous people did. He checked his watch, then checked it again. A few minutes later, Anne appeared. The moment Charles saw her, he smiled. Anne smiled back. "How long have you been waiting?" "Not long." Anne narrowed her eyes. "That means you've been here a while." "Possibly." She laughed. "You're terrible at lying." "Good thing I don't do it often." The evening began with a simple decision. Neither wanted anything fancy. Neither wanted a formal restaurant. Neither wanted an expensive experience. Instead, they started walking. That had become their thing. Conversations seemed easier while moving, more natural, less pressured. Several blocks later, the smell of food drifted through the air. A line of food trucks occupied part of a busy street. Anne immediately smiled. Charles noticed. "What?" Her smile widened. "I love food trucks." "Really?" "Absolutely." "That's surprisingly enthusiastic." Anne pointed toward the trucks. "Look at the options." Charles laughed. "You sound excited." "I am." Within minutes they found themselves studying menus. Neither could agree quickly, which somehow became entertaining. "What about this one?" Charles asked. "No." "Why?" "I don't trust it." "You don't trust food?" "I don't trust food with that many exclamation marks on the menu." Charles burst out laughing. "That's your reasoning?" "Absolutely." "What if it's amazing?" "What if it's not?" Several minutes later, they finally settled on a truck, both approved of. Food in hand, they found a nearby seating area. The city glowed around them. People passed constantly. Music drifted from somewhere nearby. The atmosphere felt alive, comfortable, fun. For a while they focused on the food. Then the conversation resumed, as it always did. At one point, Charles took a bite and immediately looked impressed. Anne noticed. "What? This is actually good." Anne folded her arms. "Actually good? I wasn't expecting much." "You insulted my food truck." "I complimented it." "You doubted it first." Charles laughed. "You remember everything." Only important things. The conversation moved effortlessly between humor and genuine discussion. One moment they debated food. The next they discussed travel, then books, then childhood memories. Time seemed to disappear. At one point Anne laughed so hard she nearly dropped her drink. Charles pointed immediately. "There it is." "What?" "The thing." "What thing?" "You laugh before the joke is finished." Anne stared at him, then laughed again. "That's not true." "It absolutely is." "No." "Yes." She shook her head, still smiling. The exchange continued for several minutes. Neither seemed interested in winning. The fun came from the conversation itself. As the evening progressed, something shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, subtly. The awareness between them became harder to ignore. Charles noticed how easily Anne made him laugh, how comfortable he felt around her, how little effort conversation required. Most relationships began with people trying to impress each other. That wasn't happening here. Neither seemed interested in pretending. Anne noticed different things. She noticed how safe she felt, how calm she felt, how Charles listened without interrupting, how he paid attention to details, how he treated everyone around him exactly the same way he treated her. That consistency mattered a great deal, because Anne had spent years questioning people's intentions, years wondering what they truly wanted, years watching behavior change whenever wealth entered a situation. With Charles, none of that existed. He expected nothing, wanted nothing. He simply enjoyed being with her. The realization affected her more than she expected. As evening slowly became night, the city lights grew brighter. The crowds shifted, yet neither seemed interested in leaving. Eventually, Charles checked the time, then looked surprised. "We've been here for hours." Anne glanced at her phone. Her eyes widened. "Oh, exactly." Both laughed. Neither had noticed. The conversation simply kept going. One topic led naturally into another, then another, then another. At some point the hours stopped mattering. They decided to walk again. The city streets felt different at night. Quieter in certain areas, more reflective. The pace slowed. Their conversation did too, not because they had run out of things to say, because the evening had become more comfortable, more personal. At one point they stopped near a street performer playing music. Several people gathered nearby. Neither spoke for a moment. They simply listened. The music drifted through the cool night air. When it ended, applause followed. Then the crowd slowly dispersed. Charles glanced toward Anne. She was smiling. "What?" Anne looked at him. "Nothing." "That usually means something." She laughed. "Maybe I'm just having a good time." The answer seemed simple, yet it carried more meaning than either wanted to acknowledge. Because the truth was obvious. They were having a good time. A very good time. The kind that becomes increasingly difficult to leave. Eventually reality forced the issue. It was late. Work awaited in the morning. The evening couldn't continue forever, no matter how much neither wanted it to end. They reached the point where their routes separated. The same thing happened that had happened after the snowstorm. A pause. Small, yet noticeable. Neither immediately said goodbye. For a moment both simply stood there. Finally, Anne smiled. "This was fun." "It was." The answer came instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Just truth. Anne nodded. "We should do it again." Charles smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." The smile Anne gave him afterward stayed with him long after she walked away. And judging by the expression on Charles's face, his smile stayed with her too. As they headed in opposite directions, both carried the same realization. The friendship that began in a broken elevator wasn't quite the same anymore. Neither was ready to define it. Neither wanted to rush it. Yet denying it was becoming difficult. Something was growing between them. Something meaningful. Something worth protecting. And perhaps the clearest sign of all was this. Neither had wanted the night to end. Not even a little. The relationship changed gradually. Neither Charles nor Anne woke up one morning and suddenly decided they were in love. Life rarely worked that way. Instead, the connection deepened through ordinary moments, shared experiences, conversations, trust, the small building blocks that create something lasting. A few weeks after their first official date, spending time together had become a natural part of life. Dinner, after work, weekend walks, occasional movie nights. Simple things. The simplicity was one of Charles's favorite parts. There was no pressure, no performance, no pretending. With Anne, he felt comfortable being himself. That comfort became increasingly rare as adulthood grew more complicated. One Friday evening, they were walking through Manhattan after dinner when Anne suddenly stopped. Charles looked at her. "What?" "My family is having a gathering on Sunday." "Oh?" Anne nodded. "A cookout." Charles smiled. "Sounds fun." "It is." She hesitated briefly, then smiled. "You should come." The invitation caught him slightly off guard. Not because he didn't want to go, because he understood what it meant. Meeting family was different. Family mattered, especially to Anne. "You sure?" "Absolutely." Charles laughed. "You make it sound like I'm being interviewed." Anne immediately pointed at him. "You are." "I knew it." "You'll be evaluated." "By who?" "Everybody." Charles groaned dramatically. "This sounds dangerous." Anne laughed so hard, she nearly stopped walking. "Relax. I don't believe that. You'll be fine." The confidence in her voice helped. A little. Still, Sunday arrived with more nervousness than Charles expected. Not fear. Just anticipation. The same anticipation people often feel before entering an important chapter of someone's life. The gathering took place in a residential neighborhood in Brooklyn. The moment Charles stepped through the gate, he immediately understood why family meant so much to Anne. The atmosphere felt alive. Children raced across the yard. Music played nearby. Food filled long tables. Conversations overlapped. Laughter seemed to come from every direction. People talked simultaneously. Nobody appeared concerned about speaking one at a time. The energy felt welcoming, warm, authentic. Before Charles could properly take everything in, Anne leaned closer. "Ready?" "No." "Good answer." Then she grabbed his hand and guided him forward. Within seconds, people began greeting them, smiling, talking, asking questions. Charles barely had time to answer one before another arrived. At one point, he looked toward Anne. "How many people are here?" Anne laughed. "I have no idea." "That's concerning." "You'll survive." For the next several hours, Charles experienced something he hadn't realized he was missing. Community. Not networking. Not professional relationships. Not business conversations. Community. People checking on one another. Sharing food. Sharing stories. Sharing life. Nobody seemed concerned with status. Nobody cared about job titles. Nobody cared about who earned more money. People cared about people. That difference struck him immediately. At one point, Charles found himself helping move tables across part of the yard. Nobody asked him to. He simply noticed it needed doing. Several others joined in. The task took only a few minutes, yet afterward, everyone continued talking and laughing, as though they had known each other for years. The sense of inclusion surprised him. More than once he caught himself smiling without realizing it. Anne noticed. Eventually she joined him near one side of the yard. "You look happy." Charles glanced around. Children playing. People laughing. Music drifting through the air. Then he looked back at her. "I am." The answer came easily, because it was true. Anne smiled. The expression softened her face. For a second, neither looked away. Then a loud burst of laughter nearby interrupted the moment. Both laughed too. The spell broke, yet something remained. A feeling neither wanted to examine too closely. As afternoon turned into evening, the gathering continued. Food was replaced by desserts. Conversations shifted. Stories became more animated. Charles found himself participating naturally. The nervousness from earlier disappeared completely. At one point, he sat listening to several relatives debate which New York neighborhood had the best food. The discussion somehow became intensely competitive. Charles laughed so hard his stomach hurt. Anne watched from nearby. Something about the sight affected her more than expected, because Charles wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing. He wasn't pretending. He simply fit. The realization brought a quiet sense of happiness. Much later, as the gathering finally began winding down, Charles and Anne found themselves walking toward the subway together. The evening air felt cooler. The streets were quieter. For several moments, neither spoke. Both seemed content simply walking side by side. Eventually, Anne broke the silence. So what? What did you think? Charles looked at her, then smiled. I think I understand you better now. Anne tilted her head. What does that mean? Charles considered the question carefully. It means I understand why family matters so much to you. For a second, Anne said nothing. The answer touched her more deeply than she expected, because it wasn't a compliment. It was understanding, real understanding. Charles continued, Everybody looks out for each other. They do. You don't see that everywhere. Anne smiled softly. No, you really are lucky. The words hung between them. Anne glanced down briefly, then back up. Yeah. The answer came quietly. Yeah, I am. As they continued walking, the distance between them felt smaller than usual. Not physically, emotionally. Something had shifted again. The relationship was becoming more meaningful, more personal, more important. Neither needed to say it aloud. They both felt it. For Charles, being welcomed into Anne's world had revealed something beautiful. For Anne, seeing Charles embrace that world had revealed something equally important. He wasn't just someone she enjoyed spending time with anymore. He was becoming someone she could genuinely imagine building a future with. And somewhere between the laughter, the conversations, and the sense of belonging, romance had quietly begun taking root. Neither rushed it, neither forced it. Yet both could feel it growing. And for the first time, the possibility of something lasting no longer felt distant. It felt real. The weeks following the family gathering became some of the happiest either of them could remember. Not because life suddenly became perfect. Life never worked that way. Work remained demanding. Schedules remained busy. Unexpected problems continued appearing. The difference was that they no longer faced those ordinary frustrations alone. Somewhere along the way, Charles and Anne had become each other's favorite person to call. A difficult day felt easier after hearing the other's voice. A funny moment felt incomplete until it was shared. Good news became better when there was someone waiting to celebrate it with you. The relationship had settled into something steady, comfortable, real. And as their connection deepened, Anne found herself paying closer attention than ever. Not because she doubted Charles, because experience had taught her to be careful. Over the years, she had watched countless relationships change after money entered the picture. People who seemed genuine suddenly became different. Expectations appeared. Entitlement appeared. Conversations shifted. The person disappeared. The fortune became the focus. Anne hated that. More than anything, she wanted certainty. She wanted to know that the man she cared about loved her, not her resources, not her influence, not the life she could provide. That certainty mattered enough that she continued keeping her secret, even as their relationship grew stronger, even as her feelings deepened, even as the possibility of marriage became increasingly real. The strange thing was that Charles made hiding the truth both easier and harder. Easier because he never gave her a reason to worry. Harder because every day she delayed telling him felt less comfortable. The conflict quietly grew inside her, yet she continued waiting, watching, listening, learning. One Saturday afternoon, they met for lunch in Manhattan. The restaurant was small, casual, the type of place Charles preferred. After finishing their meal, the server placed the bill on the table. Before Anne could reach for it, Charles picked it up. You don't have to do that. I know. Then why are you? Charles smiled. Because I invited you. Anne studied him. Most people would think nothing of the exchange. Anne did. Because she had learned to pay attention to small things. Small things revealed bigger truths. The server returned. Charles paid. The conversation continued. Money never became part of it. Not once. That detail stayed with Anne, because many men she had dated previously treated every bill like a negotiation, an opportunity, a test, a statement. Charles treated it like lunch. Nothing more, nothing less. Another time, they spent an afternoon walking through several neighborhoods, exploring bookstores and coffee shops. The day had been simple, relaxing, enjoyable. As they passed a luxury car dealership, Anne casually slowed. Not because she cared about the vehicles, because she wanted to observe Charles. Some people couldn't hide their fascination with wealth. Others couldn't stop talking about expensive things. The dealership windows displayed vehicles worth more than many people's homes. Charles glanced briefly, then continued walking. The coffee shop half a block away interested him far more. Anne couldn't help smiling. He didn't even realize he was passing another test. Months earlier, she might have considered that funny. Now it felt meaningful, because Charles remained consistent, always consistent. One evening, while walking through Midtown, they passed a group of people discussing investments outside an office building. The conversation drifted loudly through the sidewalk. Business, acquisitions, market opportunities, financial growth. The discussion sounded like dozens of others Charles encountered regularly through work. Anne listened quietly, curious. Eventually, she looked toward him. "Do you ever wish you were rich?" Charles laughed. The question seemed random. What kind of rich? The really rich kind. Charles thought for a second, then shrugged. "I don't know." The answer surprised her. "You don't know?" "Money solves problems." "True. But it creates some, too." Anne raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" Charles smiled. "People." That answer caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" Charles placed his hands in his pockets as they continued walking. "I've worked with wealthy clients. And most are decent." The answer came honestly. "But some spend their lives wondering whether people actually like them." Anne became very quiet. Charles continued. "That sounds exhausting." The words landed more heavily than he realized, because he had accidentally described part of Anne's life. Yet he had done it without knowing, without hidden motives, without realizing the truth. For a moment, Anne simply listened. Then she asked softly, "You really think that?" "Absolutely." Charles looked toward her. "If somebody only values you because of what you have, that's not much of a relationship." The statement stayed with Anne long after the conversation ended, because he believed it. She could hear it, feel it. There was no performance in his voice, only conviction. Months continued passing. The relationship grew stronger, and still, Charles never asked questions, never investigated her finances, never pushed for details, never hinted at expectations. The absence of curiosity was almost remarkable. One evening they sat together in a small park after dinner. The city lights glowed in the distance. People passed occasionally. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Anne glanced toward him. "Can I ask you something?" Charles laughed. "That sentence usually means trouble." "Maybe. I'm listening." Anne hesitated. The question mattered more than he realized. "What if one day you discovered something huge about me?" Charles looked amused. "That sounds dramatic." "Just answer." "Depends." "On what?" "Whether it's something bad." Anne smiled despite herself. "No." Charles leaned back slightly. "Then I'd probably want to understand it." The answer seemed simple, yet it revealed something important. Anne continued. "You wouldn't be angry?" "Not automatically. You'd just want to understand?" "Yeah." The response came immediately, without hesitation, without suspicion. Anne looked away briefly. A strange mixture of relief and guilt settled inside her, because the truth she was hiding wasn't small, it was enormous. And every day that truth remained hidden became more difficult. Not because she feared Charles, because she cared about him. The deeper her feelings became, the more she questioned how long she could continue waiting. Still she waited. Part of her needed certainty, needed proof, needed one final confirmation that everything she believed about him was real. The months provided that confirmation repeatedly. Charles never changed. Not once. The kindness remained. The respect remained. The honesty remained. The patience remained. Most importantly, the way he treated Anne never shifted. Whether they were eating from food trucks, walking through the city, spending time with family, sharing quiet evenings together, nothing changed. There were no conditions attached to his affection, no hidden agenda, no expectations, just consistency. And consistency, Anne had learned, was one of the rarest qualities a person could possess. One autumn evening, they sat together watching the sunset reflect against the Manhattan skyline. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence felt comfortable, the kind that develops only after people become truly close. Eventually, Charles glanced toward her. A smile appeared. "What?" Anne asked. Charles shook his head. "Nothing. You're smiling." "I know." "Why?" For a second he seemed to consider his answer. Then he looked directly at her. "Because I'm happy." The simplicity of the statement affected Anne more than elaborate speeches ever could. Because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was honest. And honesty mattered. A lot. As they sat together watching the city lights begin to emerge, Anne realized something she could no longer deny. She wasn't simply falling for Charles. She was already there. Completely. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it brought clarity. Because after all the observations, all the questions, all the quiet tests, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Charles loved the version of Anne he believed was standing beside him. The ordinary woman. The cleaner. The friend. The partner. And he had absolutely no idea that she possessed a secret capable of changing everything. For now, however, that secret remained hidden. And as the months continued moving forward, another realization began forming inside Charles's heart. A realization that would soon lead him toward one of the most important decisions of his life. Because for the first time since losing the future he thought he wanted, he had found a future he couldn't imagine losing. By the time another year began, Charles no longer measured his life by what he had lost. For a long time after the broken engagement, that had been difficult. Every plan reminded him of disappointment. Every memory carried traces of regret. Those feelings had faded, not because he forced them away, because life had gradually given him something new to focus on. Anne. The realization arrived slowly. Then, all at once, one evening, Charles sat alone in his apartment overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched across the distance. Traffic moved steadily below. The skyline looked exactly as it had for years. Yet everything felt different. His attention drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on a nearby shelf. A picture taken during one of their weekend outings. Nothing dramatic, just a simple moment. Both smiling, both happy. Charles found himself staring at the photograph longer than expected. Then he laughed quietly, because he finally admitted something he had been avoiding for weeks, maybe months. He couldn't imagine life without her. The realization didn't scare him. That surprised him. After everything he had experienced, he expected fear. Instead, he felt certainty. Not certainty about the future. Nobody possessed that. Certainty about Anne. The difference mattered. He trusted her, respected her, admired her. Most importantly, he enjoyed everyday life more when she was part of it. That wasn't infatuation. That wasn't excitement. That was something deeper, something stronger. Charles leaned back in his chair. The answer seemed obvious now. He loved her. The realization settled comfortably inside him, as though it had been waiting there for some time. The following weeks only strengthened that feeling. Nothing dramatic happened. No major event. No grand revelation. Life simply continued, and every ordinary day reinforced the same truth. Whether they were sharing coffee, walking through the city, spending time together after work, or simply talking about their day, Charles felt at peace around her. One Saturday afternoon, they visited a small bookstore they both enjoyed. While Anne browsed a nearby shelf, Charles found himself watching her. Not in a dramatic way, not in a movie scene kind of way, just quietly. The way people sometimes watch someone they care about deeply. Anne looked up unexpectedly, caught him staring. A smile immediately appeared. "What?" Charles shook his head. "Nothing. You were staring." "I was thinking." "Dangerous." Charles laughed. "Probably." Anne stepped closer. "What were you thinking about?" For a second, Charles considered telling her. Not everything, not yet, but part of it. Instead he smiled. "I'll tell you later." Anne narrowed her eyes. "I don't trust that answer." "You shouldn't." Both laughed. Yet the moment stayed with Charles long after they left the bookstore. Because he already knew. He knew exactly what he wanted. The only remaining question was how. The proposal needed to feel like them. Not social media. Not attention. Not performance. Just honesty. Just sincerity. Just two people. That was all he wanted. Weeks passed as Charles quietly planned. The process felt strangely emotional. Not because he worried she would say no, because he wanted the moment to reflect how much she meant to him. Every idea that felt flashy was immediately rejected. Every idea that felt artificial disappeared. Eventually he settled on something simple. A place that already mattered. A place connected to their story. A place where conversation had always come easily. The evening arrived sooner than expected. The weather was pleasant. The city carried its usual energy. Charles spent most of the day distracted. Not nervous, exactly. Focused. His co-workers noticed immediately. One even stopped by his office. "You okay?" Charles looked up. "Yeah. You seem distracted." "I'm fine." The co-worker studied him, then smiled knowingly. "Good luck." Charles blinked. "Good luck with what?" The co-worker laughed and walked away. Apparently he wasn't as subtle as he thought. By evening, Charles found himself waiting for Anne. His heart beat slightly faster than usual. Not from fear, from anticipation. When Anne arrived, her smile immediately settled his nerves. "There you are." Charles laughed. "There, the first AM. Why do you look nervous?" "I don't." "You do." "I absolutely do not." Anne folded her arms. "You absolutely do." Charles shook his head. "Let's walk." The answer only increased her suspicion. Yet she followed anyway. The route felt familiar. The conversation felt familiar. Everything felt normal, at least on the surface. Underneath, Charles carried a question that would change both of their lives. Eventually they reached a quieter section of the city overlooking part of the water. The location wasn't famous. That was intentional. It belonged to them. Not the public. Not social media. Them. For several moments they stood side by side, watching the lights reflect across the water. Neither spoke. The silence felt peaceful. Then Charles exhaled slowly. Anne immediately noticed. "There it is." "There what is?" "The thing you've been trying to hide all evening." Charles laughed. "I wasn't hiding anything." "You were." She smiled. "What is it?" Charles looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman who entered his life after heartbreak. The woman who made ordinary days feel meaningful. The woman who never asked him to be anyone except himself. The woman he loved. For a brief moment, words failed him. Anne's smile softened. The seriousness in his expression finally reached her. The atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, quietly, naturally. Charles took a step closer. "Anne." The way he said her name made her heart begin beating faster. Neither laughed now. Neither looked away. "I spent a long time believing I understood what I wanted from life." Anne listened silently. The city lights reflected in her eyes. Charles continued. "Then life changed." His voice remained steady. "I lost things I thought were permanent." The words carried truth, not bitterness. Just truth. "And for a while I wasn't sure I'd ever trust anyone again." Anne felt emotion rising in her chest. Because she knew how difficult that chapter had been. She had watched him heal, watched him rebuild. watched him become stronger. Charles smiled softly. Then a broken elevator changed everything. The memory made Anne laugh through the emotion. That's still a ridiculous story. It is. But it brought me to you. For several seconds, neither spoke. The moment settled around them. Warm, honest, real. Charles reached into his pocket. Anne's eyes widened slightly. The realization arrived instantly. Her breath caught. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely stunned. Charles took another step forward. I don't have a speech. Anne laughed softly. A tear formed anyway. Good. I'm serious. I know. I just know this. His voice grew quieter, more personal. I love who I am when I'm with you. Anne's eyes immediately filled. Charles continued. I love your heart. Another tear slipped free. I love your kindness. Charles smiled. I love the way you care about people. The emotion became impossible for Anne to hide. And I love the life we're building together. For a second his voice nearly failed him too. The feeling behind the words was simply too real. Then he lowered himself onto one knee. The world seemed to stop. Not literally. Cars continued moving. People continued walking. The city continued existing. Yet for Anne, everything narrowed to a single moment. A single man. A single question. Anne, Charles smiled. The smile carried nervousness, hope, love, everything. Will you marry me? The answer arrived before she could stop it, before she could overthink, before fear could interfere. Yes. A laugh escaped her immediately afterward. Then another. Then tears. Happy tears. The kind that appear when joy becomes too large to contain. Yes. Charles laughed too. Relief flooded through him. Anne covered her face briefly, still laughing, still crying. Then she pulled him into a hug. The embrace lasted a long time. Neither wanted to let go. Eventually Charles slipped the ring onto her finger. Both stared at it, then at each other, then laughed again, because neither could fully believe the moment was real. As they stood together overlooking the water, a deep sense of peace settled over them. For Charles, the future suddenly felt bright again. For Anne, the happiness carried a complication she couldn't ignore. The secret, the one truth she still hadn't revealed. The businesses, the fortune, the empire, everything remained hidden. As Charles wrapped an arm around her shoulders, Anne leaned against him, smiling, happy, terrified, because she loved him, truly loved him. And the longer she waited, the harder the truth would become. Yet, every previous experience had taught her caution. Every previous disappointment had taught her patience. So she said nothing. Not that night. Not yet. Instead, she allowed herself to enjoy the moment. The engagement. The excitement. The future they believed was waiting ahead. Over the following weeks, wedding discussions began. Plans formed. Ideas developed. The excitement grew. Friends celebrated. Families celebrated. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone seemed hopeful. And through it all, one enormous secret remained hidden between the two people preparing to spend the rest of their lives together. A secret powerful enough to change everything. As the wedding moved closer, Anne knew she could not keep the truth buried forever. Sooner or later, Charles would learn who she really was. The only question was when, and neither of them realized just how close that moment had become. The wedding was approaching, and so was the truth. 3 weeks before the wedding, Charles believed he understood exactly who Anne was. That belief would be challenged before the night was over. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, a major corporate acquisition event, one of the largest business announcements of the year. Attendance from investors, executives, financial analysts, and industry leaders. Charles wasn't surprised his company wanted representation there. Events like this were common in his profession. Important, useful, occasionally boring. He glanced through the details while drinking coffee at his desk. Nothing immediately stood out. The location was impressive. The guest list looked significant. Otherwise, it appeared to be another professional obligation. By lunchtime, he had nearly forgotten about it. That evening, while sharing dinner with Anne, he casually mentioned the event. "I've got one of those giant corporate gatherings next week." Anne looked up. "Oh, apparently it's a big deal." She smiled slightly. "They always say that." Charles laughed. "That's true. What is it about?" "Some acquisition." Anne nodded. "Sounds exciting." "It sounds like 3 hours of speeches." That earned a laugh. The conversation moved on. Yet for a brief moment, Anne looked thoughtful. Very thoughtful, Charles noticed. "What?" "Nothing." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. But before he could ask another question, she smoothly changed the subject. Charles didn't think much of it. He had no reason to. The following week passed quickly. Work remained busy. Wedding planning continued. Life moved forward. Then the evening finally arrived. The ballroom occupied one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels. Everything about the event reflected money. Massive crystal chandeliers, perfectly arranged tables, professional media teams, private security. The atmosphere carried a level of importance that even Charles immediately recognized. As he entered the venue, he adjusted his tie and scanned the room. Hundreds of attendees filled the space. Executives, investors, journalists, business leaders, people whose decisions influenced entire industries. Charles quietly found his assigned table. The room buzzed with conversation. Several familiar faces from the financial world moved between groups. Nothing unusual, at least not yet. One of Charles's colleagues sat nearby. "This turnout is bigger than I expected." Charles nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." The colleague glanced toward the stage. "Whoever is behind this acquisition must be important." Charles followed his gaze. The stage looked impressive. Large screens, professional lighting, everything carefully designed. The room carried a strange sense of anticipation, as though everyone was waiting for someone. The event officially began several minutes later. An MC welcomed guests. Introductions followed. Industry achievements were discussed. Financial projections appeared on screens. Charles listened politely. Mostly, his attention wandered occasionally. The presentation felt familiar, predictable. Then something changed. The shift happened so suddenly that people noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Several executives stood from their seats. Charles frowned. A strange energy moved through the room. Journalists grabbed cameras. Investors adjusted their posture. Even the event organizers looked different, more alert, more focused. "What happened?" Charles asked quietly. His colleague looked confused too. "No idea." The ballroom entrance opened. A few people near the front immediately began applauding. Others followed. Within seconds, the reactions spread throughout the room. Charles turned toward the entrance. At first, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. His mind rejected the image, refused it, because it didn't make sense, not even a little. Anne stood at the entrance. Charles blinked. Once, twice. Still Anne, his fiancée, the woman he planned to marry. The woman who spent years working inside the same office building. The woman everyone believed was part of the cleaning crew. The applause grew louder. Charles remained frozen. His confusion deepened. Why was she here? More importantly, why was everyone reacting this way? Several powerful executives immediately approached her, not casually, respectfully, almost eagerly. Industry leaders smiled. Investors extended hands. People with extraordinary influence appeared genuinely pleased to see her. Charles watched in complete disbelief. His heart began beating faster. Something was wrong. Or perhaps something had always been wrong, and he was only now realizing it. Anne moved through the ballroom with calm confidence. No nervousness, no hesitation, no uncertainty. The behavior felt completely natural, as though she belonged there, as though she had done this countless times before. Charles couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with the woman he thought he knew. His colleague leaned closer. "Do you know her?" Charles stared, unable to answer immediately. "Yeah, The word barely escaped. The colleague looked surprised. "You know her?" Charles nodded slowly. The confusion inside him intensified. Because he knew Anne, or at least he thought he did. Yet nothing about this situation made sense. Then the room changed again. Everyone stood. Not some people. Everyone. Executives rose from their chairs. Investors stood. Industry leaders stood. Journalists stood. The entire ballroom rose to its feet. Applause erupted. The sound echoed throughout the venue. Charles remained seated for a second longer than everyone else. Not intentionally. His body simply forgot to move. Eventually he stood too, still staring, still trying to understand. Anne acknowledged several greetings, then walked toward the stage. Not toward a seat, not toward a reserved guest section, toward the stage. The realization hit Charles immediately. A cold sensation spread through his chest. No. That was impossible. Yet Anne continued walking, straight toward the podium. The applause intensified. The MC stepped aside, respectfully, deliberately, like someone welcoming a person far more important than himself. Anne stepped onto the stage. The ballroom instantly became silent. Charles felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Then the MC spoke. The words changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen." The room waited. The MC smiled. "Please welcome the owner, principal investor, and visionary behind tonight's historic acquisition." Applause exploded again. Charles stopped breathing. Owner, principal investor, visionary. The words collided with everything he believed about reality. Everything. The screens behind Anne illuminated. Images appeared. Corporate logos, business achievements, financial headlines, company valuations. The information rolled across the massive displays. Each revelation felt more unbelievable than the last. Anne wasn't connected to the acquisition. She controlled it. Anne wasn't attending the event. She was the reason the event existed. Anne wasn't employed by the cleaning company. She owned organizations worth billions. The realization crashed into him all at once. The woman he loved, the woman he planned to marry, the woman he thought he knew, was one of the wealthiest people in America. Around him, executives watched Anne with admiration. Investors listened carefully. Industry leaders treated every word as important. Yet Charles barely heard the presentation. His mind raced. Questions flooded his thoughts. How long had she been hiding this? Why hide it at all? How much of their relationship had been real? How much didn't he know? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, why hadn't she told him? On stage, Anne spoke confidently, gracefully, naturally. The room listened. The room respected her. The room understood exactly who she was. Only Charles remained stunned, because in a ballroom filled with powerful people, he suddenly felt like the last person learning the truth. And for the first time since meeting Anne, he genuinely didn't know what would happen next. The applause continued long after Anne finished speaking. Investors approached the stage. Executives waited patiently for opportunities to greet her. Journalists positioned themselves for interviews. The ballroom buzzed with energy. Charles barely noticed any of it. He remained standing near his table, staring toward the stage. His mind struggled to process everything he had just witnessed. The woman he planned to marry. The woman he believed worked as part of a cleaning crew. The woman who laughed with him over coffee and food trucks. The woman who cried when he proposed. That woman had just been introduced as the owner of a business empire worth billions. Nothing about that sentence felt real. For several minutes, Charles simply watched. Anne moved through the crowd speaking with investors and business leaders. Yet something about her expression seemed different, even from a distance. She wasn't enjoying this moment. At least, not completely. Every few seconds, her eyes searched the room, searching for someone, searching for him. Eventually, their eyes met. The noise around them seemed to disappear. For one brief moment, neither moved, neither smiled, neither looked away. The expression on Anne's face immediately told Charles something important. She had expected this, not the reaction, the moment. She knew this day would come. She always knew. The realization landed heavily. Several more minutes passed before Anne finally excused herself from a conversation and began walking toward him. People stepped aside as she approached. Some nodded respectfully. Others greeted her. Anne acknowledged them politely, yet her focus never left Charles. When she finally stopped in front of him, neither spoke immediately. For the first time since they met, silence felt uncomfortable. Not hostile, not angry, just heavy. The weight of an enormous truth sitting between them. Finally, Anne spoke. "Charles." Her voice sounded softer than usual, almost uncertain. Charles looked at her, really looked at her. The same eyes, the same smile, the same woman. And yet, everything felt different. Or perhaps nothing had changed at all. He wasn't sure. "I think we need to talk." Anne nodded immediately. "Yes." The answer came almost as a whisper. "Please." A short time later, they found themselves in a private conference room away from the ballroom. The noise from the event faded behind closed doors. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence stretched. Anne finally sat down. Charles remained standing, running a hand across the back of his neck, trying to find the right place to begin. Unfortunately, there wasn't one, because how exactly did someone begin a conversation like this? Eventually, Charles laughed once, a short, disbelieving laugh, not because anything was funny, because reality felt impossible. I don't even know what question to ask first. The honesty in his voice hurt Anne, because she understood exactly why. She folded her hands together. For the first time all evening, she looked nervous, genuinely nervous. Not billionaire nervous, not executive nervous, just Anne, the woman afraid of losing someone she loved. "Then I'll start." Charles nodded. The room grew quiet again. Anne inhaled slowly, then exhaled. "The businesses are real." A small smile touched her face. "I guess that's obvious now." Charles sat down across from her, still listening, still processing, and continued. "My family built part of it." Her voice remained calm. "After I inherited my share, I expanded it." Charles said nothing. The explanation continued. Years of investments, acquisitions, growth, companies operating across multiple industries, organizations employing thousands of people. The scope felt almost impossible to comprehend. Yet none of those details mattered as much as the next question. Eventually, Charles asked it. "Why?" The word lingered between them. Anne knew exactly what he meant. Why hide it? Why pretend? Why keep such a massive secret? She looked down briefly, then back up. The answer required honesty. Complete honesty. "I got tired." Charles frowned slightly. "Tired?" Anne nodded. "Tired of people changing." The room became very quiet. She continued. "The moment people discovered the truth, a sadness entered her voice. Everything changed." Charles listened carefully. Anne wasn't speaking like a billionaire. She was speaking like someone carrying years of disappointment. Conversations changed. She looked away briefly. Relationships changed. A painful smile appeared. People changed. Charles remained silent, allowing her to continue. "Some became interested in me overnight." The smile disappeared. "Others stopped seeing me as a person." Her eyes met his again. They saw opportunities. The words felt deeply personal, because they were. Anne had lived through it repeatedly, for years. Charles slowly leaned back. The explanation made more sense than he expected. Not all of it, but enough. Anne continued. "I wanted to know who actually cared about me." The room remained quiet. "I wanted real friendships." She laughed softly, without humor. "I wanted real relationships." For a moment, emotion threatened to overwhelm her. She pushed forward anyway. "That's why I started spending time anonymously." Charles listened carefully. "The cleaning job?" Anne nodded. Partly?" A small smile returned. "It started as research." Charles blinked. "Research?" The answer sounded so strange he almost laughed. Anne did laugh. A nervous laugh. I know how that sounds. No. Charles shook his head. I need you to explain that. For the first time since entering the room, some of the tension eased. Anne smiled, then explained. She wanted to observe people, study behavior, see how employees treated individuals they believed had no influence, no status, no power. The more she talked, the more the pieces began fitting together. The observations, the cleaning crew, the anonymity, everything connected. Anne continued. I learned more about people pushing a cleaning cart than I ever learned sitting in boardrooms. Charles found himself believing her, because he had seen those behaviors himself. The way some people ignored workers, the way others showed respect. The differences were impossible to miss once you paid attention. Then Anne's voice softened. That's when I noticed you. The statement immediately shifted the atmosphere. Charles looked at her. Anne smiled slightly. You were always kind. Charles laughed quietly. There it is. What? That thing you do. What thing? You compliment me when you're nervous. To his surprise, Anne laughed. A real laugh. The sound helped. The room felt lighter, only slightly, but enough. Then the laughter faded. The seriousness returned, because the hardest part still remained. Anne looked directly at him, and for the first time all evening her composure truly began cracking. Tears formed. Not dramatic tears, honest ones. The kind people fight unsuccessfully to hide. Charles, her voice trembled, just a little. I didn't hide this because I wanted to hurt you. The words landed heavily. I know. Anne shook her head. No. Another tear escaped. I need you to understand. The emotion in her voice became impossible to ignore. I was terrified. Charles stared at her. The vulnerability surprised him, because this wasn't the powerful executive from the stage. This was the woman from the elevator, the woman from family cookouts, the woman who loved food trucks, the woman who laughed too early at jokes. Anne continued. Every time I thought about telling you, I got scared. The confession came out slowly, painfully. What were you scared of? For a second, Anne couldn't answer. The truth felt too exposed, too vulnerable. Finally she whispered it. Losing you. The room fell silent, completely silent. Anne lowered her eyes. More tears appeared. I know how crazy that sounds. It doesn't. Her eyes immediately lifted, surprised. Charles continued listening. Anne pressed forward. People always changed after finding out. A tear rolled down her cheek. Always. The word broke something inside her, because it carried years of experience, years of disappointment, years of uncertainty. I didn't want you to become one more person who looked at me differently. The sentence hung between them, heavy, raw, painfully honest. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just emotional. Because the truth was finally sitting in the open. No more secrets, no more hiding, no more pretending, only honesty. And now, everything depended on Charles's response. The future, the engagement, the wedding, the relationship, everything. Anne sat across from him, trying unsuccessfully to stop her tears, waiting, hoping, terrified. Because despite all her wealth, despite all her influence, despite all her success, there was one thing she could not control: whether the man she loved would still see her the same way after tonight. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty frightened her more than anything money could ever solve. For several moments after Anne finished speaking, the room remained completely silent. Neither moved, neither rushed to fill the space. The truth had finally been spoken. Every secret, every fear, every reason. Nothing remained hidden. Anne sat across from Charles, trying to steady her breathing. The tears had slowed, but the emotion remained. Years of caution, years of protecting herself, years of wondering whether people loved her or her success. Everything had led to this moment. And now she waited. Not as a billionaire, not as a business owner, not as one of the most powerful women in the country. Just Anne, a woman hoping the man she loved still saw her the same way. Charles leaned back in his chair. His thoughts moved slowly, not because he was angry, because he was trying to process a reality he never expected. The woman he loved owned companies worth billions. The woman he loved had been hiding a life completely different from the one he imagined. The woman he loved had spent years observing people from behind a cleaning cart. It sounded unbelievable. And yet somehow, it still felt like Anne. That realization stopped him. Because the more he thought about it, the more one simple truth became impossible to ignore. Nothing about Anne's personality had changed tonight. Not one thing. The woman who sat across from him was still the same woman who laughed at his terrible jokes. The same woman who walked through a snowstorm beside him. The same woman who welcomed him into her family's world. The same woman who cried when he proposed. The same woman who made ordinary days feel meaningful. The money was new information. Anne wasn't. Eventually, Charles smiled. A small smile. The kind that appears when a complicated question suddenly finds a simple answer. Anne immediately noticed. Confusion crossed her face. Then uncertainty. Then hope. Charles leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Anne laughed through the last traces of tears. The sound carried disbelief. After everything that had happened, he wanted to ask a question. Still, she nodded. "Okay." Charles looked directly at her. His voice remained calm, gentle, steady. The question came exactly as it existed in his heart. "Are you still the woman who laughed with me in that broken elevator?" The room became silent again. Anne froze. Completely. For a second, she simply stared at him. The question wasn't about money. It wasn't about companies. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about business. It was about her. Only her. The tears returned immediately. This time she made no attempt to stop them. Because after all the fears, after all the worry, after all the nights spent wondering how this conversation would end, Charles had just given her the answer she needed most. Anne nodded. Once, then again. A laugh escaped through the tears. "Yes." Her voice cracked. "Yes." Another tear slid down her cheek. Charles smiled. Then nothing important changed. The words shattered every remaining wall around her heart. Anne covered her face briefly, trying unsuccessfully to compose herself. It didn't work. Years of fear collapsed all at once, not because of what Charles said, because of what he didn't say. He didn't ask how much she was worth. He didn't ask about private jets. He didn't ask about investments. He didn't ask about properties. He asked whether she was still Anne, the woman he loved. Nothing else. Anne stood suddenly, crossed the distance between them, and wrapped her arms around him. The hug lasted a long time, longer than either realized. Because for the first time since revealing the truth, she finally felt safe again. Not safe financially. Safe emotionally. The kind of safety money could never purchase. Eventually, she pulled back slightly, still smiling, still emotional. "You have absolutely no idea how much I needed to hear that." Charles laughed softly. "I think I do." Anne shook her head. "No." Fresh tears appeared. "You really don't." For several minutes, they talked. Not about business. Not about acquisitions. Not about wealth. About them, their future, their relationship, their wedding. The conversation felt lighter now. The uncertainty was gone. The secret was gone. For the first time since meeting each other, there was nothing left hidden between them. And that honesty made everything stronger. The weeks that followed became some of the happiest of their lives. Wedding preparations accelerated. Family members became excited. Schedules became crowded. Plans became real. For Charles, the adjustment to Anne's true financial status took time. Not because it bothered him, because it was difficult to comprehend. Occasionally, he would witness business executives treating Anne with extraordinary respect. The contrast still surprised him. One moment, she was discussing wedding flowers. The next, she was making decisions that affected entire companies. Yet despite everything he learned, one fact remained unchanged. Anne was still Anne, the woman who laughed too early at jokes, the woman who loved family gatherings, the woman who valued people more than appearances, the woman he planned to spend his life with. Meanwhile, news of Anne's engagement gradually spread through business circles. Articles appeared. Announcements circulated. Industry publications discussed the upcoming wedding. The attention felt unavoidable. One afternoon, months after ending their relationship, Charles's former fiancée came across one of those announcements. At first, she barely paid attention. Then she noticed the photograph. Her expression changed immediately because she recognized him. Charles, the man she left behind. The man she once believed couldn't provide the future she wanted. The article described Anne's accomplishments, her businesses, her influence, her extraordinary success. The numbers alone felt impossible. The realization arrived slowly. Then all at once, the man she abandoned for wealth had fallen in love with a woman whose success surpassed anything she ever imagined. Yet the money wasn't what hit hardest. What hit hardest was the photograph. Because Charles looked genuinely happy, not successful, not impressive, happy. The kind of happiness that couldn't be purchased. The kind of happiness she once had an opportunity to protect. For several moments, she stared at the image, then quietly closed the article. Because some lessons arrive too late, and some opportunities never return. Back in New York, however, Charles wasn't thinking about the past. His attention remained firmly fixed on the future. The wedding day finally arrived beneath clear skies. The atmosphere felt joyful from the very beginning. Family members gathered. Friends arrived. Excitement filled the air. The celebration reflected everything both Charles and Anne valued. Love, family, community, connection. Not status, not wealth, connection. As Charles stood waiting, a strange sense of peace settled over him. Years earlier, he believed losing his former relationship meant losing his future. Now he understood how wrong he had been. Sometimes life removes the wrong path before revealing the right one. When Anne appeared, the entire room seemed to brighten, not because of what she owned, because of who she was. Their eyes met. Both smiled. The journey that brought them here flashed through their minds. The elevator, the conversations, the snowstorm, the first date, the proposal, the reveal. Every moment mattered. Every step mattered, because every step led here. The ceremony itself felt beautiful in its simplicity. No performance, no spectacle, just two people making promises they fully intended to keep. When they exchanged vows, emotion spread throughout the gathering. When they exchanged rings, tears appeared. When they were finally pronounced husband and wife, applause erupted. The celebration that followed felt exactly like something Anne would love. Laughter, music, family, stories, food, joy, everywhere. At one point during the reception, Charles found Anne standing alone for a moment, watching everyone celebrate. He stepped beside her. "What are you thinking about?" Anne smiled. "Us." Charles wrapped an arm around her. "Good answer." Anne laughed, then looked toward the people they loved. "I almost ruined this." "No." Charles shook his head gently. "You protected yourself." Anne looked at him. The understanding in his voice still amazed her. Charles smiled. "And eventually, you trusted me." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt peaceful. Then Anne leaned her head against his shoulder. The future stretched ahead of them. Unknown, imperfect, real, exactly the way life was supposed to be. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. People spend so much time chasing appearances, status, money, recognition. Yet the most valuable things in life rarely appear on financial statements. Trust, respect, character, loyalty, love. Those things create the richest relationships. Not wealth, not power, not prestige. Character, because money can attract attention. But character earns trust. Money can create opportunity, but character creates lasting relationships. And sometimes the greatest heartbreak of your life isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's simply clearing the path for the blessing that was waiting all along. Before we end today's story, we'd love to hear from you. If you discovered that the person you loved had hidden a secret like Anne's, would you have stayed? Have you ever been judged based on money, status, or what people assumed about you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Because the strongest relationships are built on who people are, not on what they have. And that lesson is worth carrying with us long after the story ends.